The enemy commander laughed when his scouts reported only 12 Americans on the ridge. He actually laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to mock the very idea of resistance. He poured himself a steaming cup of tea, the ceramic warmth a stark contrast to the brutal winter howling outside his command tent. He looked at his gathered officers, men who had seen their share of easy victories, and said simply, "Kill them all before breakfast." There was no hesitation in his voice. He didn't send a warning. He didn't offer surrender terms or a chance for the defenders to lay down their arms. He just pointed a gloved finger at the jagged, snow-swept mountain and told his men to erase every living soul defending it. Women, wounded, medics, the order was absolute. Nobody gets out. That cold, calculated order changed everything that happened next. If you've never heard the name Rachel Cain, you're about to understand why entire enemy battalions still argue about what happened on that frozen ridge in the middle of a nameless war. Staff Sergeant Rachel Cain had been awake for 31 hours by the time the transport helicopter dropped her unit onto the frozen face of Blackstone Ridge. The wind hit like a physical wall the moment she stepped off the ramp, a screaming gale that threatened to throw her back into the hold. It wasn't the kind of cold that makes you pull your jacket tighter. It was the kind of cold that reaches through fabric, through muscle, and straight down to the place where your confidence lives, and it starts squeezing. It was a predatory cold. She didn't flinch. She pulled her rifle case off the cargo net with a practiced grace, her movements economical and fluid despite the heavy gear. She checked the snap locks with 2 fingers without even looking down, her eyes already scanning the horizon. She turned to face the ridge like she was reading a map she'd already memorized in a past life, her gaze sharp and analytical. Private First Class Danny Ockhaffer stumbled off the helicopter behind her, his boots sliding on the slick ice. He immediately grabbed her sleeve, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. "Sergeant Cain," he said, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the rotor noise, "tell me this looks worse than it is." Rachel looked at him, her eyes steady. Then she looked at the ridge. She saw the way the ice-covered rocks jutted out like broken, blackened teeth against a sky that had already started turning the color of a fresh bruise. She saw the narrow paths that wound up through exposed snowfields, kill zones where any advancing enemy would have a full, unobstructed view of the defensive line. She saw the radar station sitting exposed and half-buried in massive drifts near the summit, its silhouette lonely and vulnerable. She looked back at Danny, who was waiting for a lie. "It looks exactly like it is," she said. Danny closed his eyes for 1 full second, the snow already crusting on his eyelashes. "That's what I was afraid of," he whispered. She almost smiled. Almost. The platoon was 12 soldiers total, a skeleton crew for a mission this critical. 6 had combat experience, men and women who had seen the elephant and knew the sound of incoming fire. 3 were medics who had been cross-trained for defensive operations, their bags heavy with both morphine and extra ammunition. 2 were communication specialists who had never fired their weapons in a live engagement outside of the controlled environment of qualification ranges. And then there was Private Marcus Webb. He was 19 years old, with the kind of youthful energy that hadn't yet been eroded by the reality of the front. He had volunteered for this deployment because he told his recruiter he wanted to see real action. Rachel had heard Marcus say that during the initial briefing and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the plummeting temperature. She'd seen what real action looked like up close. She'd held men while they died from it, watching the light leave their eyes in the mud and the dark. Lieutenant Cole Mercer assembled the platoon at the base of the ridge's first switchback. Snow was already coating the shoulders of his jacket, forming a white mantle that made him look older than his years. He looked at the group the way a man looks at a hand of cards he knows isn't strong enough to win the pot. "Listen up," Mercer said, his voice cutting through the wind. "We hold this radar station for 48 hours minimum. Reinforcements are staged and moving, but the weather has grounded all air support. Resupply is not guaranteed. We operate on what we have, and we make every round count." Silence followed his words, heavy and thick. Then Corporal Tomas Reyes, a heavy-set man from San Antonio who kept a weathered rosary wrapped tightly around his wrist, raised his hand halfway. "Sir, what's the intel on hostile activity in the valley?" Mercer's jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek. Scouts reported mercenary movement approximately 6 miles northeast. "Unknown numbers, unknown objective." "Unknown objective," Reyes repeated slowly, the words hanging in the freezing air. "Sir, respectfully, there's only one objective if they're heading this direction. That's us. Which is why we hold the ridge," Mercer said flatly, ending the discussion. Questions? More silence. Rachel didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask anything. She was already studying the terrain above them, picking apart the ridgeline in her mind the same way a master chess player disassembles a board. She wasn't looking at the pieces. She was looking at the spaces between them. There was a rock formation about 400 meters up the south face that created a natural blind, a perfect notch in the earth. Someone positioned there with a clear optic could cover nearly the entire approach from the valley without being silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. She made a mental note of it, the coordinates burning into her memory without the need for paper. Mercer dismissed the platoon to begin setting defensive positions, and the scramble of boots on stone began. As the soldiers started their arduous climb, the lieutenant fell into step beside Rachel. "Cain," he said, his voice dropping so low only she could hear it over the whistling wind. "I'm putting you in overwatch on the eastern ridgeline. Primary observation post." "Understood," she replied. He paused, and she could feel him about to say something else, something he'd been holding back since they left the briefing room. "I'm going to be straight with you," Mercer said. "You're the best qualified for that position, but that ridge is going to be the first thing they try to collapse. If they hit us hard enough, I can't promise you backup." Rachel kept walking uphill, her pace steady and rhythmic. "You can't hold that position alone," Mercer said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite an apology. It sat somewhere in between, a recognition of the sacrifice he was asking her to make. She stopped walking and turned to look at him directly. Mercer had been around enough combat veterans to recognize the specific kind of calm she was projecting. It was the kind of calm that isn't peace. It's just pressure that's been compressed so many times it stopped making noise. It was the silence of a deep-sea trench. "When do we move out?" she asked. He searched her face for something, doubt, fear, a crack in the icy exterior. He didn't find one. 2,000 hours, he said. Rachel nodded once, a sharp, professional motion, and turned back toward the mountain. What Mercer didn't know, what almost nobody in this platoon knew, was that Rachel Cain had already survived something that should have destroyed her. It wasn't just physical survival. It was the kind of event that reshapes a person's interior architecture the way a flash fire reshapes metal. You come out harder in some places, and in other places, you come out missing parts entirely. 3 years earlier, in a classified operation across a border that officially didn't exist, Rachel had been part of a 6-person sniper team inserted into a mountainous region of Eastern Europe. Their mission was to extract a defecting intelligence asset with keys to a kingdom of secrets. The mission lasted 4 days. When it ended, only 2 people walked out. Rachel was one of them. The other man who survived never spoke about it publicly, and neither did she. The file was sealed with enough red tape to choke a city. The families of the men who died received condolence letters that described training accidents in locations that didn't match any military base on record. But Rachel remembered every detail. She remembered the metallic smell of the mountain air, the specific way the extraction went wrong, and the moment she understood that the safe house had been compromised. She remembered the moment she had to make a decision, try to hold the position and wait for backup that wasn't coming, or break contact and move the asset out alone while the rest of her team bought time with their lives. She made the decision. She moved the asset, and the men who stayed behind never came home. The logic of it was sound. Tactically, there was no other choice. Every instructor she'd ever trained under would have made the same call. She knew that. She told herself that more times than she could count, in more dark rooms and in more hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when sleep refused to come. But logic and guilt don't always speak the same language. Guilt speaks in the voices of the dead. For 3 years, she'd been carrying 2 things: a heavy rifle and the faces of 5 men who trusted her enough to stay behind so she could go forward. That weight was still there, pressing down on her shoulders when she finally set up her observation post on Blackstone Ridge. It would be there for every hour of what was coming next. She positioned her rifle case behind a natural rock shelf that provided excellent cover. She constructed a rudimentary hide using her white camouflage netting, blending herself into the snowy landscape until she was virtually invisible. Then, she settled in to watch the valley below. The valley was wide and deep, carved by some ancient glacier into a shape that funneled wind and sound in strange, unpredictable directions. At the far end, almost invisible in the early storm haze, was the frozen mouth of a river that came down from the eastern mountains. That river delta was the only wide, flat approach that armored vehicles or large infantry units could use at any significant speed. She noted it. She also noted 3 narrower routes up through the jagged rock. These were paths that a small, disciplined unit moving in single file could climb in the dark without being heard until they were almost at the top. She noted all 3. For an hour, nothing moved in the valley except the swirling snow. Then her radio crackled with a burst of static. It was Corporal Ray's checking in from the southern defensive line. "Can you see anything?" "Negative," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Valley's clean for now." "For now," Ray's repeated, his voice carrying a hint of nervous energy. "Love the confidence. How are your fields of fire?" "Decent," she replied. Webb keeps repositioning himself every 5 minutes because he can't decide which direction he's most scared of. Rachel closed her eyes briefly, visualizing the young private's frantic movements. Tell Webb to pick a position and stay in it. Movement in the dark makes you a target before you ever see the threat. "Copy," Ray's said. "Hey, Sergeant Cain. Yeah, you ever been in a defensive action before? Held ground under sustained assault?" She was quiet for a moment, the memories of Eastern Europe surfacing like ghosts in the mist. "Yes," she said. "How did it go?" She thought about that mountain, about the sounds of frantic radio calls that came through her earpiece for 2 hours before they stopped forever. She thought about standing on a rainy runway in Germany 40 hours later, being debriefed by men in civilian clothes who kept saying the mission was a success. "We held," she said. "It wasn't entirely a lie." "Good enough for me," Ray's said. "Ray's out." She settled back into her position, her eye pressed against the optic. She was still watching when Private Danny Aucaffer appeared behind her position about 2 hours later. He was moving quietly, or trying to, but not quietly enough for a mountain ear. She heard his boots on the rock 12 steps before he appeared. "You're loud," she said without turning around. "Sorry," Danny said, startled. He crouched beside her, his breath misting in the freezing air. "Lieutenant wants a full assessment of approach vectors. Visual confirmation before he adjusts the defensive plan. Tell him 3 viable infantry approach routes on the western face, all of them narrow," Rachel said, her voice devoid of emotion. "1 wide vehicle approach along the frozen river delta, currently obscured by the storm, but it will be visible once the wind direction shifts around 0300. Tell him if they are professional, they'll hit the narrow roads first to draw our attention while something heavier comes up the delta." Danny was writing furiously in a small notebook, his fingers stiff and clumsy with the cold. "How do you know they'll do it in that order?" "Because that's how I do it," Rachel said. Danny stopped writing and looked at her. The snow was beginning to pile up on his helmet. "How long have you been a sniper?" he asked. 7 years, and before that, infantry. So you've done this from both sides?" "Yes." Danny sat quiet for a moment, the wind pushing at his jacket. His notebook was getting dusted with fine, powdery snow. Then he said something that surprised her, something most people were too afraid to ask. "Are you scared?" Rachel kept her eyes on the valley. Most soldiers asked her about her kill count, about what her longest confirmed shot was, or whether it was different being a woman in the teams. She despised those questions, not because they were inappropriate, but because they revealed what the person asking actually believed, that her gender or her statistics were more interesting than the reality of the work. Nobody asked if she was scared. "Yes," she said. Danny blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "You don't look it. Looking scared doesn't help anything," she said. "Being scared is honest. Staying anyway is the job." Danny absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. He looked out over the valley at the enormous dark and the endless snow. He knew that somewhere out there, men were moving toward them with weapons and the intent to kill. "I've never been in combat before," Danny said softly. "Not real combat. I've done training. I've done exercises. But this..." He stopped and swallowed hard. "This is real." "Yes," Rachel said, "it is." "Does it get easier after the first time?" She thought about the answer carefully, the way she always thought about things that mattered. "Some parts," she said, "the mechanical parts. The training takes over and you stop thinking and you just execute. That gets easier." She paused, the wind howling through a gap in the rocks. "The other parts don't get easier. They just get quieter." Danny nodded slowly, as if he were memorizing her words. "Go give the lieutenant my assessment," Rachel said. "And Danny, put your glove liners back on. Frostbite on your trigger hand is a bad way to start the night." Danny looked down at his bare hands and immediately started pulling his liners on. He thanked her and moved off into the dark. Once again, she was alone. For a while, the only sounds were the wind and the faint, unsettling creak of ice settling somewhere far below. She ran her fingers along the cold barrel of her rifle, the way some people touch rosary beads. It wasn't for luck or comfort exactly. It was for the feeling of something solid and reliable when everything else was uncertain. She thought about the men she'd lost. She thought about their faces, frozen in time. She didn't push the thoughts away. She'd learned a long time ago that pushing those thoughts away just made them louder in the silence. So she let them come. She sat with them for a few minutes, acknowledging the debt she owed them. Then she let them settle and she focused. Because somewhere in the valley below, she could see something that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She pressed her eye to the scope, adjusting the focus for the shifting light. The storm haze was beginning to thin in one specific corridor of the valley, the western approach. Along that corridor, barely visible and almost swallowed by the dark, she could see the faint, rhythmic blink of infrared signal lights. 2 quick pulses, one long, 2 quick, one long. She knew that pattern instantly. It wasn't random navigation. That was a coordination signal used when units were dividing into multiple attack elements and confirming their positions relative to each other. They weren't scouting. They were already in position. She hit her radio immediately. All stations, this is Cain on Overwatch. I have confirmed hostile activity western approach corridor. Multiple infrared signals indicating unit coordination. They are already staged. This is not a probe. I say again, this is not a probe. A moment of static followed, then Mercer's voice came back, hard and fast. How many? Can't confirm yet, she replied. Signal suggests at least 3 separate elements. Could be more. Time to contact. If they are moving now, 20 minutes to the base of the ridge. Less if they're moving fast. Another pause. She could hear Mercer relaying orders in the background, voices sharpening up across the defensive line. The sound of soldiers shifting from the boredom of waiting to the sharp readiness of impending combat. Cain, Mercer said, hold your position. Do not fire unless you have confirmed targets. Copy, she said. She settled back into her rifle, her body becoming as still as the stone beneath her. 20 minutes. She had 20 minutes before everything changed. She used every one of them. She mapped the approach corridor in her mind, calculating distances, wind angles, and likely movement patterns. She identified the places where the terrain would funnel soldiers into tight lines, making them easier to hit and harder to scatter. She calculated the shot sequence she would use if they came up the western face, then the southern, then the eastern. She built a mental file of contingencies so deep and detailed that by the time the first shapes began appearing at the valley floor, she was ready in a way that wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. It was pure. It was the one gift the 3 years since Eastern Europe had given her, the ability to step completely outside of herself in a moment of high danger. She saw the first element moving up the western face in a staggered column. She counted them silently. She breathed. She waited. Lieutenant, she said quietly into the radio, I have visual on lead element. Western face, approximately 22 confirmed hostiles moving in staggered formation. They have communications gear and at least 2 crew-served weapons. I identify a drone operator third from the front, distinctive antenna pack on the rig. Hold fire, Mercer said. Wait for my command. She waited. She watched the column move uphill with the confidence of soldiers who had been told their objective was lightly defended. She watched them not looking up, scanning side to side, checking their flanks but never looking toward the ridge above. They didn't know she was there. She was a ghost in the snow. And then Mercer said the words, Cain, weapons free. She exhaled slowly, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The wind paused for one fraction of a second, the way it sometimes does in the mountains, as if even the weather holds its breath in anticipation. She fired. The drone operator went down first, the impact of the round throwing him backward into the snow. Before his body finished falling, she was already cycling the bolt, adjusting 14 inches for the second shot and breathing out again. The second shot took out the lead element's communications man, the soldier carrying the heavy radio pack that would have allowed them to call in armored support. In the first 4 seconds of the engagement, Rachel Cain had removed the enemy's eyes and their voice. What followed next was pure chaos for the men in the valley. But for Rachel, it was nothing but geometry. Target, distance, wind, breath, trigger. One after another, the enemy assault began coming apart at its edges. And far below in the darkness of the frozen valley, the enemy commander who had laughed that morning and ordered his men to kill them all before breakfast, picked up his radio and heard something that confused him deeply. His lead assault element was collapsing, and none of his men could figure out where the shots were coming from. He asked his communications officer for a report. The officer looked at the radio and said very quietly, "Sir, the assault team's comms operator is down. I can't raise them." The commander stared at the ridge through his thermal scope. He wasn't laughing anymore. He started to wonder whether 12 Americans on the ridge might not be the number he was actually fighting. Because on that ridge, in the dark and the wind and the blinding snow, one woman was fighting like an entire army, and she was just getting started. The first assault died in under 4 minutes. It didn't end slowly, and it didn't end with a warning. It collapsed the way a stone wall collapses when the foundation is kicked out from under it. Fast, total, and loud enough that everyone nearby felt it in their chest. Rachel had taken out 11 men before the remaining enemy fighters even understood which direction the shots were coming from. They scattered across the western face, pressing themselves against rocks, screaming into radios that no longer connected to anyone, because the man carrying their communications gear was already face down in the snow with a hole through his chest. Down on the defensive line, Corporal Thomas Reyes pressed himself against his position and listened. He could hear the shots from Rachel's overwatch, each one distinct, spaced by a single breath, precise as the ticking of a clock. He counted 11, then there was silence. He keyed his radio with a shaking hand. Cain, what is your status?" Her voice came back even and calm. "Western face is neutralized. 11 confirmed down. Remaining hostiles have broken contact and are retreating to the valley floor. I estimate 8 to 10 survivors from the lead element." Reyes exhaled so hard his whole body shook. "You got 11 of them before they even returned fire." "They returned fire," Rachel said simply. "They just didn't know where to aim." Private Danny Aucaffer, crouched 3 meters from Reyes, looked up with eyes wide enough to show white all the way around. Did she just take out 11 guys by herself in like 4 minutes?" "Apparently," Reyes said, staring out into the dark. "In a blizzard." "Danny," Reyes added quietly, "stop talking and check your sector." Lieutenant Mercer came across the radio 30 seconds later, his voice carrying the particular tightness of a man who had just recalculated everything he thought he knew about the next 48 hours. "Cain, excellent work. Can you confirm the retreat is genuine and not a feint?" Rachel was already watching through her optic. "Retreat is genuine. They're moving fast and they're not coordinated. This wasn't how they planned to start the engagement." A pause. "Lieutenant, they had a drone operator and a comms man in the lead element. I took both of them first. They've lost their forward observation capability for now. But that's temporary. They have support in the valley. They will regroup." "How long?" Mercer asked. "An hour, maybe less if their commander is smart." Mercer processed this. "What do you need up there?" Rachel's answer was immediate. "Ammunition resupply and tell whoever is on the south face to move the machine gun position 12 meters west. The way it's currently set up, it has a dead zone on the lower switchback. If a second element comes up from that angle, there's a gap." There was a pause on Mercer's end. "How do you know where the machine gun is?" "Because I can see it from up here and it's wrong," she said. Mercer relayed the order without further question. The machine gun moved. Private Marcus Webb, the 19-year-old who had wanted to see real action, was the one who moved it. His hands were shaking so badly that Sergeant First Class Ortega had to help him reset the tripod. Ortega didn't say anything about the shaking. He just placed Webb's hands on the grip and told him to breathe. "Just breathe and stay locked onto your sector." "How is she doing that?" Webb whispered. "How is she doing that alone up there?" "Because she's been doing it longer than you've been alive," Ortega said. "Now lock in." The hour that followed was the strangest kind of quiet that soldiers learned to dread. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a hell-breath quiet. The kind that means something terrible is coming and just hasn't arrived yet. Rachel used every minute of it. She shifted her position twice, moving to different points along the ridgeline to map the valley from different angles. She counted vehicle signatures through the storm using the faint heat bloom that armored engines threw even in the bitter cold. She identified at least 3 armored vehicles holding position at the valley floor and 2 additional infantry elements that hadn't committed to the assault yet. She did all of this while a thin line of blood ran down the inside of her sleeve. A rock fragment, kicked up by an enemy round during the first exchange, had caught her forearm. She hadn't mentioned it on the radio. She simply pressed a strip of medical tape against it without breaking her observation rhythm and kept working. Ray's called up 40 minutes into the quiet. Cain, you eating anything up there? No, you should eat something. Noted. That wasn't a suggestion, Sergeant. She actually paused at that. Are you mothering me, Corporal? I'm maintaining combat effectiveness across the whole unit, Ray's said. That includes you. Webb ate 2 energy bars in the last 20 minutes. He stress eats. I'm not judging, but you should eat something. Despite everything, the cold, the blood, and the weight sitting inside her chest, Rachel felt something that almost resembled warmth. I have a protein bar in my left pocket, she said. I'll eat it. Good, Ray's said. I'll stop bothering you. You won't, she said. He agreed, I won't. She ate the protein bar without taking her eye off the valley. 53 minutes after the first assault collapsed, the enemy moved again. Rachel saw it first. The armored vehicles at the valley floor began repositioning, not toward the western face, but angling toward the frozen river delta. At the same time, she picked up movement on the southern face. Infantry was moving in a different pattern than before, tighter, more disciplined. These weren't the same soldiers who had scrambled in confusion. These men moved like they'd been briefed on exactly what went wrong the first time. She felt her pulse shift gears. All stations, she said, her voice staying flat even as her internal tempo accelerated. Second assault is initiating. Split element. Armored vehicles moving to the river delta approach, infantry moving up the south face simultaneously. They adapted. This is coordinated. Mercer came back immediately. How many on the south face? Estimating 30 to 40, moving in 3 sub-elements with space between them. They're staggered to prevent a single engagement from stopping the whole advance. She tracked them through her scope, counting movement signatures. Their commander learned from the first assault. He's spreading his force so I can't suppress the whole line at once. A pause on Mercer's end lasted 2 seconds too long. Rachel heard what he didn't say in that silence. Lieutenant, she said, I need the machine gun on the south face firing on the lower element as soon as they hit the 300-meter line. That creates a forcing function. They either push through fire or they slow down. If they slow down, I can work. She didn't wait for a response. She was already tracking the lead man of the southern element. This was no longer about taking out specialists. This was about managing the flow of the battle. She had to become the regulator of their speed. If she could make them hesitate, if she could inject enough doubt into their advance, the 12 defenders on the ridge had a chance. If she failed, they would be overrun in minutes. The armored vehicles in the delta began to fire, their heavy cannons booming like thunder in the narrow valley. The shells hit the face of the ridge, sending plumes of snow and shattered rock into the air. The ground beneath Rachel shook, but she didn't move. She couldn't afford to. She focused on the infantry. She fired, and the lead man on the south face dropped. She fired again, and the man behind him fell. But this time, they didn't stop. They didn't scatter. They kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades with a grim determination. Rachel's breathing was a steady, rhythmic hiss in the cold. She was cycling the bolt with a speed that would have been impossible for a lesser shooter. Each shot was a calculation of wind and arc, a testament to years of training and a mind that could shut out everything but the objective. The enemy was within 200 meters now. She could hear the cracks of their rifles returning fire, the rounds whistling past her hide or thudding into the rock shelf. Mercer, the south face is pushing hard, she radioed. Machine gun, open up. A second later, the heavy chatter of the M240B joined the symphony of the battle. The red tracers cut through the dark, chewing into the enemy line. The advance slowed. It didn't stop, but it stuttered. That was all Rachel needed. She began picking off the officers, the men trying to rally the elements to continue the push. The battle for Blackstone Ridge was no longer a skirmish. It was a desperate struggle for survival. And in the center of it all was Rachel Cain, a woman who had lost everything once and was determined not to let it happen again. She wasn't just defending a radar station. She was defending the 11 lives behind her. She was the barrier between them and the order to kill them all before breakfast. As the snow continued to fall and the enemy continued to climb, Rachel Cain pulled the trigger again. She was the ghost of the mountain, and she would not be moved. The pressure on the south face was relentless. Even with the machine gun and Rachel's precision fire, the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. The enemy was using the terrain better now, leaping from cover to cover, crawling through the deep drifts where the tracers couldn't reach them. On the western face, the armored vehicles had stopped firing their main cannons and were now using their heavy machine guns to suppress the summit, keeping Mercer and the others pinned down while the infantry moved in for the kill. Rachel's rifle was hot to the touch. the heat shimmering off the barrel in her scope's view. She had transitioned from deliberate, long-range shots to rapid engagement. She was a blur of movement, fire, cycle, fire, cycle. She had lost track of her kill count. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the distance between the lead enemy and the defensive perimeter. 100 meters, 80 meters. "Lieutenant, they're getting too close," Rachel radioed, her voice tight for the first time. "I can't stop them all from here." Mercer's voice came back, strained and punctuated by the sound of nearby explosions. "We're holding as best we can, Cain. Just keep their heads down." Suddenly, a flash of light caught her eye from the valley floor. One of the armored vehicles was launching something, not a shell, but a drone. A larger, more sophisticated model than the one she'd taken out earlier. It banked sharply and began climbing toward her position. They'd found her. The infrared signals from earlier hadn't just been for coordination. They had been triangulating her shots. She had seconds to decide. If she stayed, the drone would mark her with a laser or drop a munition directly on her hide. If she moved, the infantry on the south face would have a clear run to the perimeter. She looked through her scope one last time, seeing Private Danny Aucaffer frantically reloading his rifle in a shallow trench. He looked terrified, but he was still there. He was staying anyway. Rachel didn't hesitate. She didn't pack her gear. She didn't move to a safer position. She stood up from her hide, exposing herself to the freezing wind and the enemy fire. She slung her rifle over her shoulder, pulled a flare from her vest, and struck it. The brilliant red light hissed into life, illuminating her like a beacon against the snow. Every enemy eye in the valley turned toward the red light on the ridge. The armored vehicles shifted their fire. The infantry on the south face paused, confused by the sudden display. Rachel took the flare and threw it as far as she could toward a secondary rock formation 50 meters away. Then she dropped back into the shadows and ran. The drone followed the flare. The heavy machine guns followed the flare. The rock formation was pulverized in seconds, a storm of lead and fire that would have shredded anything in its path. Rachel, meanwhile, was already in a new position, a tiny crevice she'd noted hours before. She didn't have her netting. She didn't have her rock shelf, but she had her rifle. She took aim at the drone, which was hovering over the burning flare. She fired once, and the drone spiraled out of the sky, a broken toy falling into the abyss. Then she turned her attention back to the south face. The enemy was moving again, but the pause had given Mercer and his men enough time to reposition their own grenades. A series of explosions rocked the slope, sending the lead element tumbling back. The second assault was broken. The enemy retreated once more, leaving behind a trail of bodies in the snow. The valley fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning flare. Rachel sat in her crevice, her chest heaving, her hands finally beginning to shake. She was covered in gray rock dust and frozen slush, but she was alive. "Cain, status?" Mercer's voice was a whisper on the radio. "I'm here," she said. "I'm okay." There was a long silence on the other end. "That was the craziest thing I've ever seen." Danny's voice broke in, sounding like he was on the verge of tears or laughter. "You're a ghost, Sergeant. You're a freaking ghost." Rachel didn't respond. She just watched the valley. The enemy commander wasn't laughing, and he wasn't drinking tea. He was staring at the ridge with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had lost nearly half his force to 12 soldiers and one woman who refused to die. But Rachel knew he wasn't done. He had one more approach, the river delta. And the armored vehicles were already starting their engines. She looked at her remaining ammunition. She had 2 magazines left. 48 hours was still a long way off. But as she tucked a stray lock of hair under her helmet and pressed her eye back to the scope, Rachel Cain knew one thing for certain. They might kill them all before breakfast, but they were going to have to work for every single inch of that ridge. And she was going to make sure they remembered her name until the end of their days. The wind surged again, a violent reminder of the ridge's indifference to the small war being waged on its skin. Rachel felt the bite of the air on her exposed skin where her camouflage had been torn during her desperate sprint. She didn't feel the cold as pain anymore. It had become a dull, constant hum, a background frequency she had learned to tune out. Her arm was throbbing where the rock fragment had sliced her, and she could feel the sticky warmth of fresh blood beneath her sleeve. She ignored it. There was no time for injuries. Below, the armored vehicles were groaning to life, their diesel engines sending thick plumes of black smoke into the white-out conditions. They were moving now, the 3 remaining transports lurching forward onto the frozen river delta. It was a bold move, a gamble that the ice would hold their weight and that the defenders were too depleted to stop them. On the ridge, the mood had shifted from the adrenaline high of the second victory to a grim, silent preparation. They all knew what was coming. The Delta approach meant heavy weapons, and heavy weapons meant the end of their cover. Cain, Mercer radioed, his voice sounding hollow. "I'm seeing the armor moving. We don't have anything that can punch through their plating. If they get to the base of the ridge, they'll just sit there and level the station." Rachel watched the vehicles through her optic. They were moving in a tight diamond formation, their turrets rotating, searching for targets. She saw the lead vehicle's tracks churning up the snow, the heavy metal plates clanking with a rhythmic, menacing sound. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice steady, "the ice on the Delta is thick, but it's not uniform. There's a thermal vent about halfway across, near the old bridge pilings. The ice there is thinner. If we can break the surface, the lead vehicle goes down. The others will have to stop or risk the same." Mercer was silent for a beat. "We don't have any artillery, Cain. How are we supposed to break the ice?" "I can do it," she said. "There's a fuel pod on the back of the lead vehicle. It's an external tank for long-range patrols. If I hit the valve, the fuel spills onto the ice. Then I hit it with an incendiary round. The heat will do the rest." Mercer's voice was skeptical. "That's a 500-meter shot in a blizzard, hitting a target the size of a grapefruit on a moving vehicle. It's the only way," she replied. There was a pause. "Do it," Mercer said. Rachel shifted her position slightly, finding a more stable rest for her rifle. She reached into her vest and pulled out a single, specialized round, a silver-tipped incendiary she'd been saving for a moment just like this. She chambered it, the click of the bolt sounding like a death knell in the quiet. She took a breath, letting it out slowly, watching the lead vehicle through the scope. The wind was gusting, pushing the snow in erratic curtains across her field of vision. She waited for the gap, the moment when the wind died down just enough. The vehicle was nearing the bridge pilings. She could see the fuel pod now, a dark shape against the camouflage of the hull. She focused on the valve. She felt the rhythm of the world slow down, the heartbeat of the mountain matching her own. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a sharp, familiar bite. Through the scope, she saw the valve shatter. A dark liquid began to spray out, coating the ice beneath the vehicle. She didn't wait. She cycled the bolt and chambered the second round, the incendiary. She fired again. A brilliant flash of orange light erupted on the ice. The fuel ignited instantly, a lake of fire spreading beneath the lead transport. The ice, weakened by the thermal vent and the sudden, intense heat, began to groan and crack. The lead vehicle tried to reverse, its tracks spinning wildly on the slick, melting surface. But it was too late. With a sound like a thunderclap, the ice gave way. The front of the vehicle dipped into the freezing water, the weight of the armor dragging it down. The soldiers inside scrambled to escape, but the vehicle was already half submerged. The other two transports slammed on their brakes, their drivers terrified of meeting the same fate. They were stuck, pinned in the middle of the Delta with nowhere to go. On the ridge, a cheer went up from the defenders. It was a small victory, but in that moment it felt like a miracle. But Rachel wasn't cheering. She was already looking past the Delta, toward the tree line at the edge of the valley. She saw a movement, more infantry, but different this time. They weren't mercenaries. They were regulars, the enemy commander's personal guard. They were moving with a speed and precision that made the previous assaults look like child's play. "Lieutenant," she radioed, her voice low, "we've got company. The real fight is just beginning." She settled back into her crevice, her eyes fixed on the new threat. She was tired, she was bleeding, and she was almost out of ammunition. But as she watched the enemy regulars advance, Rachel Cain felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in 3 years, the voices in her head were quiet. She knew what she had to do. She was the ghost of Blackstone Ridge, and she wasn't going anywhere. The tactical reality on the ridge had shifted into a more dangerous register. Staff Sergeant Rachel Cain looked through her long-range optic, watching the enemy's movements with the detached, analytical eye of a predator. The landscape below was a jagged tapestry of shadows and snow, illuminated only by the occasional flare of a muzzle or the cold, silver light of a winter moon struggling against the heavy cloud cover. She could see the enemy elements separating, their silhouettes ghost-like against the white expanse of the valley floor. The middle and upper elements were beginning to diverge, a coordinated maneuver designed to overwhelm the ridge from multiple angles simultaneously. That movement exposes the machine gun position. Mercer's voice crackled in her earpiece, tight with the strain of command. Rachel didn't blink. She kept her eye pressed to the rubber cup of the scope, her breathing slow and measured despite the sub-zero air that threatened to crystallize in her lungs. "Yes," she replied, her voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "But if those 3 sub-elements reach the ridge at the same time, we won't have the volume of fire to stop them. We have to break the timing of the assault. The machine gun is the only asset we have that can disrupt their tempo at this range." There was a heavy pause on the line, the kind of silence that precedes a life-altering decision. Then Mercer's voice returned, harder now, more certain. "Ortega, you heard Sergeant Cain. Get that gun hot on the south face at 300 meters. The response from Sergeant First Class Ortega was immediate and as dry as sandpaper scraping over a rusted hull. "Already moving, sir." Rachel swung her scope away from the immediate threat on the slope and toward the river delta. The armored vehicles were a dark, lumbering presence against the ice, roughly 2 minutes out from the base of the approach. She could see men on foot moving behind the steel hulks, using the heavy armor as a moving shield, advancing under the protection of massive engines that roared like beasts in the valley. She did the math in her head, a cold, geometric calculation of time and distance. She had approximately 90 seconds before the south face assault hit the 300-meter line and Ortega's machine gun opened up. 90 seconds before the silence of the ridge was shattered. She used those seconds for her ritual. Before the noise became a physical weight, before the world dissolved into the chaos of lead and fire, Rachel Cain sought stillness. It wasn't just a physical quiet. She was already a statue carved from the frozen earth. It was an internal purging. She let every thought that wasn't directly related to the next sequence of survival drain out of her. She stopped thinking about the mission in Eastern Europe that had nearly broken her. She stopped thinking about the faces of the men she'd lost, the ones she carried in the quiet corners of her mind. She even stopped thinking about Mercer's words on the helicopter pad, his warning that she couldn't hold this position alone. She let it all go until she was nothing more than a functional extension of the rifle, a ghost in the machine of war. The silence broke. The machine gun on the south face opened up with a roar that cracked across the ridge like thunder splitting a granite mountain. The suddenness of the sound was jarring, a violent shift in the world's frequency. Instantly, the ridgeline changed registers. There were no more whispered radio checks or careful, hushed movements. The south face lit up with the staccato flash of muzzles and the arcing lines of tracer fire, searing through the darkness like angry fireflies. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of men shouting. They spoke a language Rachel didn't understand, but the tone was universal. It was the sound of soldiers under fire, the initial shock, followed by the searing bloom of pain, then the frantic scramble of desperation, and finally, the white-hot heat of rage. The lower enemy element on the south face took the brunt of Ortega's fire at the 300-meter mark. The lead men were cut down in the first few seconds, and the rest were forced to ground, their forward momentum dying in the snow. It was exactly what Rachel needed. With the lower element pinned, the middle element was forced to pivot, leaving them momentarily exposed. She didn't hesitate. She worked through the middle element with the same cold, geometric precision she'd used on the western face. But she was faster now. The deafening roar of Ortega's gun provided her with a rare luxury in a sniper engagement: noise cover. The sound masked her muzzle signature and the crack of her rifle, allowing her to fire at a frantic pace without immediately revealing her exact position. She dropped 6 men in under 2 minutes. It was rhythmic, lethal work. Bolt back, casing flying into the snow, bolt forward, find the center of mass, exhale, fire. But this group was different. They didn't break. They were better trained than the first wave of attackers. They pushed into the sparse cover provided by the rocks and began returning fire toward the ridgeline. It wasn't accurate fire. They were shooting at shadows and muzzle flashes, but the volume of suppressive fire was enough to make her position untenable. She moved. There was no grace in it, only efficiency. She snatched her rifle off the rest, rolled to her left, and began a low, painful crawl across 10 meters of frozen rock. The sharp edges of the stone bit into her elbows and knees, but she ignored the pain. She set up behind a different outcrop, a jagged tooth of granite that offered better protection. She was back behind her scope in under 45 seconds. It was during that movement that the first mortar round found the ridge. It didn't hit her directly, but it was close enough that the concussion felt like a physical blow to her chest. The air was sucked out of her lungs, and even through the biting cold, she felt the searing heat of the explosion on the side of her face. Shrapnel pinged against the rocks around her, a deadly hail of metal. She pressed herself flat against the frozen earth, counting to 3 as the debris rained down. Then she forced herself back up. She scanned the valley, her eyes searching for the source. The mortar team was down there, hidden in the shadows of the valley floor. She'd seen them setting up earlier, but the swirling snow had obscured her angle. Now they were dialed in. They didn't have her exact spot, but they had the general area. If she stayed in one place for more than a minute, they would walk the rounds right onto her head. She keyed her radio immediately. "I've got a mortar team in the valley south quadrant. They have my rough position. I'm going to have to keep moving. Can you neutralize them?" Mercer's voice came back, strained. "Not from here. I'd need to move to the southern ridgeline to get a clear angle. But if I move to the southern Virus Vine, I lose observation on the river delta. Can we get someone else on the delta?" Rachel thought of the 12 people remaining in the platoon. Most of them were kids who had barely finished their advanced infantry training. "Who do you have that can call targets at that range?" she asked. There was a long silence. "Nobody trained for it," Mercer admitted, the frustration evident in his voice. "Then I stay here," Rachel said, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous calm. "I keep moving. They'll keep mortaring and missing as long as I don't give them a fixed target." She heard Mercer take a sharp breath over the comms. "Rachel," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name since the shooting started. "I'm fine," she cut him off. "Focus on the south face." "How is Ortega?" "The gun is still up," Mercer replied. "Lower element is pinned, but the upper element went wide. They're trying to flank around the gun position." "I see them," Rachel said, her scope already swinging to the new threat. "I have the upper element." She engaged. What followed was 12 minutes of the most sustained, high-intensity combat she had experienced since the horrors of Eastern Europe. Mortar rounds continued to walk across the ridge every 90 seconds, each explosion close enough to vibrate the ground beneath her hands. The assault on the south face was relentless, pressing through the machine gun fire with a grim determination. The upper element was working the flank, trying to get a line on Ortega, while the armored column in the river delta was minutes away from reaching the base of the ridge. Rachel was a blur of movement and violence. She fired, and moved again. She was engaging the flanking element, tracking the delta approach, and calling in corrections to Ortega while shouting warnings to Mercer. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, she realized she was bleeding. The tape on her forearm had come loose, and the old wound was weeping into her sleeve. The cold air did nothing to help. It only made the muscle feel stiff and unresponsive. Private Danny Aucaffer appeared at her side again. This time she heard him coming. It wasn't that he was loud. He had become remarkably quiet since the first shots were fired. But Rachel had trained herself to hear everything within a 50-meter radius, even through the deafening roar of battle. "Lieutenant sent me up with ammo," Danny said. He stayed low, keeping his body pressed flat against the rock next to her. Without waiting for a request, he slid 3 boxes of rifle ammunition toward her. Good, she thought. He was learning. He was becoming a soldier in the span of a single night. "The delta approach," Rachel said, her eyes never leaving the scope. "What's Mercer's plan for when the armor hits the base?" "He's got 2 at 4s positioned on the ridge crest," Danny replied, his voice shaking slightly but holding firm. "Ortega's guys, 2 at 4s against 3 armored vehicles," Rachel muttered. She watched the column through the snow. "That's not enough." "I know," Danny said. "The lieutenant knows too. He's hoping to disable the lead vehicle and create a choke point in the delta that blocks the others." Rachel considered this for a moment. The river delta was a narrow corridor of ice and rock. If they could kill the leader in the right spot, the others would be trapped. "If Ortega's guys fire too early, they miss," she said. "If they fire too late, the vehicles are already at the base and they'll have an elevation advantage over the at 4 positions. They'll be able to rake the ridge with their mounted guns." "What's the right timing?" Danny asked. 200 meters, she said. "Tell Mercer to fire when the lead vehicle hits the 200-meter mark on the delta approach. Any closer and the angle is wrong. Any farther and the round is fighting the wind and the snow." Danny keyed his radio and relayed the information, repeating her words with a precision that impressed her. Mercer came back 30 seconds later. "Confirmed. 200 meters on the delta. Cain, I need you to keep eyes on that approach and call the range." "Copy," she replied. Danny started to pull back, his mission complete, but then he stopped. He looked at her, his eyes wide in the darkness. "Sergeant Cain?" "Yeah, Webb is scared," he said quietly. "I mean, we're all scared, but Webb is. I don't know how to say it. He's kind of freezing up. He's not making mistakes yet, he's inside his own head." Rachel finished for him. "Yeah." Rachel kept her eyes on the scope, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Tell him this, she said. Tell him the fear is the right reaction. It means he's not a sociopath. But the fear isn't the point. The point is what he does with the next 60 seconds. He doesn't have to survive the whole battle. He just has to get through the next 60 seconds. Then the 60 after that. She paused, then added, tell him I said that. I will, Danny said. And Danny, yeah, thank you for the ammo. The boy nodded and moved back down the ridge. He was careful now, watching his feet, controlling his noise. He was surviving. 30 seconds later, a mortar round hit 6 meters from Rachel's position. The impact felt like a giant's fist slamming into her spine. Rock shrapnel sliced through the outer layer of her pants, cutting into her left leg. She checked it by feel, her hand coming away wet but not soaked. It wasn't deep, but it burned like fire. It was a reminder that every second she spent in one spot was a second the enemy used to find her heart. She moved again. As she crawled, she called the range for the Delta approach. Lead vehicle at 400 meters, moving at a steady pace. No deviation. She found a new position in 12 seconds, settling the rifle back into the crook of her shoulder. Lead vehicle 350 meters. Ortega's voice came across the net, tight and focused. At 4 teams are ready. 300 meters. Rachel could feel the collective breath hold across the ridge. 12 soldiers, exhausted, freezing, and terrified, were all pointing their weapons toward the valley, waiting for a single number. 250 meters. She heard Marcus Webb's voice on the radio, a whisper directed at no one and everyone. 60 seconds. Just get through the next 60 seconds. She didn't know if her message had truly reached him or if he was just using the words as a shield against the dark. Either way, he was still there. He hadn't broken. 200 meters, Rachel said. The AT-4s fired, both of them, almost simultaneously. The sound was staggering. A sharp, metallic crack followed by a massive pressure wave that Rachel felt in her sinuses. She tracked the rounds through her scope, 2 streaks of brilliant exhaust cutting through the snowy dark toward the lead armored vehicle. One round was slightly off, clipping the left track housing and detonating against the exterior armor. It caused damage, but it wasn't a kill. The second round hit the engine compartment dead center. The lead vehicle stopped. It didn't explode in a cinematic fireball. It simply died. Thick black smoke began to pour from the chassis, rising in heavy plumes against the falling snow. The vehicle sat sideways in the narrow delta, a 3-meter wall of smoking steel that blocked the entire approach. The second and third vehicles behind it slammed on their brakes, their engines roaring in protest. They couldn't go around, the terrain was too steep, they couldn't go through. The choke point was held. A wave of something like relief washed over the ridge. Rachel heard it in the radio chatter, quick, sharp voices exchanging confirmations. Someone let out a ragged cheer. Then the second armored vehicle opened up with its mounted gun. It wasn't shooting at the ridgeline in general, and it wasn't shooting at the AT-4 positions. It was shooting at Rachel's overwatch. The rounds came across the valley in a perfectly straight line of tracer fire, beautiful and deadly. They began tearing massive chunks of rock off the formation just above her head. She was flat against the ground before the first round even hit. The sound of high-velocity metal hitting stone was a deafening, shrieking noise. Rock dust filled her mouth and nose. She pressed her face into the dirt and waited for the firing to break, her mind already analyzing the situation. The vehicle commander had narrowed her position down. He didn't have a pinpoint fix. If he did, she would already be a memory, but he had enough to suppress her. The firing stopped. She had maybe 10 seconds while the gunner reassessed his targets. She moved. She moved faster than she had all night, a low, desperate crawl that burned through her injured leg and her strained forearm. She used every ounce of physical reserve she had left, dragging herself behind a new outcrop just as the vehicle gun opened up again, vaporizing the spot she had occupied only seconds before. Danny's voice came across her earpiece, urgent and panicked. Cain, report status. She was breathing hard the first time her composure had truly slipped. I'm up, she rasped, repositioned. The vehicle gun has my old spot. We saw the fire, Danny said, his voice cracking. We thought. I'm up, she repeated, her voice steadying. Talk to me about the south face. What's the status on the flanking element? Ortega's gun stopped them, Danny replied, but he's reporting low on belts. Maybe 2 minutes of sustained fire before he has to go to single shots. 2 minutes. Rachel looked at the south face through her scope, scanning for the flanking element. They had gone to ground when the AT-4s fired, but now they were moving again. She counted 9 of them. They were disciplined, moving between the rocks with a speed that suggested they were only 20 meters away from a position that would give them a clear line on Ortega's machine gun. She had 90 seconds. "Ortega," she said into the radio, "hold your fire. I've got the flanking element. You sure? Hold your fire. I need them to move." She settled in, forcing her heart rate down. She let the flanking element start their advance, watching as they gained confidence when the machine gun remained silent. When they were fully committed to the open ground, she struck. 3 shots in 11 seconds. 3 men down. The remaining 6 scrambled for cover, their movements frantic and confused. The shots had come from a direction they hadn't expected. Rachel didn't stay to admire her work. She changed her position again, finding an angle that looked behind their new cover. "Ortega," she said, "I'm in. Remaining 6 are pinned in the rock cluster at your 10 o'clock, 20 meters out. They're stuck. If they try to push, I'll see them." "Copy that," Ortega said. There was a pause, then he added, "Cain, that's some serious shooting." She didn't respond. She was already swinging the scope back to the main body of the south face assault. The machine gun fire had stalled them, and her engagement of the flank had created a temporary crisis in their command structure. She could see it in the way the movement had ceased across all 3 sub-elements. When your flanking unit is decimated without warning, you stop. You reassess. It was instinct, but it was also a weakness she could exploit. She used the lull to check her ammunition. The numbers were not comforting. She had enough for what was in front of her right now, but the night was far from over. The infantry on the south face would regroup. The stalled armor in the delta would find a way through or around. And somewhere in the valley, there were still unknown numbers waiting for their turn. She thought about Mercer's words again. "You can't hold this position alone." He wasn't wrong about the tactical math. He was only wrong about what that meant for her. She keyed her radio. "Lieutenant, give me a full status on the platoon. I need to know what I'm working with." Mercer ran through the grim tally. 4 soldiers on the south face defensive line with Ortega. 2 comms specialists holding the radar station itself. Danny Ockhaffer running between positions. Marcus Webb on the eastern approach with 2 others. 2 soldiers were down, one with a severe leg wound, another with a concussion from the mortar strikes. They had 10 effective fighters remaining, maybe 12 if you counted the walking wounded who refused to go to the bunker. 12 soldiers on a ridge, limited ammo, no air support, and 40 hours until reinforcements. "Cain," Mercer said after he finished the rundown, "tell me honestly, can we hold this?" She didn't hesitate. "We held the first assault," she said. "We stalled the second. Yes, we can hold this." "I need more than tactical confidence right now," Mercer said, and for the first time, Rachel heard the man behind the rank. He was asking for a reason to believe. "Listen to me," Rachel said. "Every person on this ridge is still fighting. Nobody has broken. That matters more than the math. Hold your position, conserve your ammunition, and trust the next 60 seconds." There was a long silence. Then Mercer's voice came back, firm again. "Copy that." She turned her attention back to the valley. The snow was coming down harder now, a white veil that obscured the world. But through the storm, she saw them. Fresh signal lights appearing at the far eastern edge of the valley. A 3rd element, a new wave. She cataloged the movement, her mind already building the sequences for the next engagement. She would not leave this ridge. She had made that decision the moment she heard the enemy commander's order over the intercepted radio, "Leave no one alive." She wouldn't leave these boys, most of whom had never seen real blood before tonight. She wouldn't leave the wounded in the bunker. The wind shifted, howling across the rocks. Rachel Cain settled deeper into her position, the cold iron of the rifle a part of her body. She controlled her breathing and waited for the next wave to climb toward her. The 3rd element hit at 01:47 hours. Rachel had been tracking them for 22 minutes. They moved with a discipline the first 2 groups lacked. There were no signal lights, no chatter, no wasted movement. They were tight, deliberate, and professional. These weren't the same quality of fighters she had seen earlier. These were something else entirely. She keyed the radio. 3rd element is moving, eastern approach. I count at least 40, possibly more behind the storm line. They have thermal drones. I can see the operator's signatures. And Lieutenant. She paused, making sure she was seeing what she thought she was seeing. They have flamethrower units in the lead. At least 4 confirmed. The silence on the net was absolute for 3 long seconds. "Flamethrowers?" Mercer finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes." When Mercer spoke again, his voice was tight with a fear he was struggling to contain. "Cain, our defensive line on the eastern approach is Webb and 2 others. They have 1 SAW and personal weapons. That's not enough to stop flamethrowers." "I know," Rachel said, "which is why you need to pull Webb and his team back 30 meters to the secondary position behind the rock shelf. Do it now, before they hit the 400-meter line." If we pull back from the primary position, if we don't pull back, Webb and his team get burned alive, Rachel interrupted, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. The secondary position gives them overhead rock cover. Flamethrowers lose their effectiveness at range and with elevation. Pull them back. I'll handle the forward element. You'll handle 40 men and flamethrowers. I'll handle enough of them to buy us time, she said. Pull Webb back. Now, the order was given. Rachel heard Webb's voice, sounding young and terrified. We're pulling back. We're giving up the position. Ortega snapped back before Rachel could. We're not giving up anything, kid. We're making them come through a kill zone. There's a difference. Now move. Rachel was already on the move herself. She scrambled along the eastern ridgeline, her legs screaming in protest. The shrapnel wound was stiffening, and her forearm felt heavy and clumsy. She ignored it. She found a point that gave her the widest possible field of fire on the approach corridor and set up her position in the pitch black. She didn't need a light. She knew the contours of the rifle by touch and the layout of the ridge by heart. Danny, she said, right here, go to the medical bunker. Tell the senior medic to move the critical patients to the rear wall, the eastern wall specifically. If the flamethrowers reach the crest, fire will come from the east. That wall is the only hard cover they have. There was a pause. You think they might get through? I think I need our people to be in the safest possible spot regardless of what happens, Rachel said. Go. She settled behind the rifle. The thermal drones were the immediate problem. She could see 3 of them weaving through the snow, scanning the ridge for heat signatures. Every time she moved, she was a bright, glowing target on their screens. If they pinpointed her, the assault would be over before it began. She needed to take them down. But drones were small, fast, and erratic targets, especially in a snowstorm. She had enough ammunition to be wrong exactly twice. She tracked the first drone for 40 seconds, studying its flight path. The operator was nervous. She could tell by the rhythmic jerkiness of the movement. Humans under stress always revert to patterns. She found the rhythm, calculated the lead, and squeezed the trigger. The drone didn't explode, but it didn't need to. She clipped the rotor assembly, and the device went into an uncontrolled spiral, vanishing into the darkness of the slope. She was already tracking the second. The second operator saw his partner go down and immediately pulled his drone into an evasive, erratic flight. Rachel waited. She didn't chase the target, she let it settle. The human nervous system craves order. After 20 seconds, the drone's path smoothed out. She fired. The second drone dropped like a stone. The third drone went high immediately, pulling out of her effective range. The operator was smart. He would still be able to see the ridge, but his detail would be obscured by the storm. Cain, Mercer said, I see 2 drone signatures down. Was that you? 2 of 3, she replied. The third is too high. They still have eyes on us, but it's degraded. Good work, Mercer said. The element is at 300 meters. She knew. She could see them through her thermal optic. And now that the drones were less of a threat, she could see something else. The way the assault formation was structured. It was a combined flamethrower and infantry advance, a specific tactic she had seen used by elite units during her training with joint forces. These weren't mercenaries, she realized with a cold, sinking feeling. These were special operations soldiers wearing mercenary gear. Third element is special forces, she told Mercer. The radio went silent again. This was a different level of threat. These men wouldn't break like the others. They were trained to absorb casualties and keep moving until the objective was met. What do you need? Mercer asked, his voice sounding older. I need 2 minutes of suppressive fire from every position on the eastern line the moment they hit 200 meters, she said. I don't need you to hit anything. I just need noise and muzzle flashes. I need to blind that last drone and create enough confusion in their feed that they can't tell where I am. Copy that, Mercer said. Eastern line on my command. Rachel watched the Special Forces team advance. They were at 250 meters. They were moving in a staggered diamond formation, the flamethrower units protected in the center. They were fast, efficient, and terrifyingly quiet. 200 meters, Rachel said. The eastern line erupted. It was a wall of noise and light, a chaotic symphony of lead. It wasn't aimed, but it served its purpose. The valley floor was illuminated by the flickering light of tracers and muzzle bursts, creating a strobe-like effect that would scramble any thermal imaging from above. In that chaos, Rachel became a ghost. She didn't fire at the infantry. She ignored the men with the rifles. Her entire world narrowed down to the 4 men carrying the heavy tanks on their backs. The first flamethrower unit was at 180 meters. She took a breath, held it, and fired. The tank didn't explode, that was a myth from the movies, but the pressurized fuel ignited instantly. A geyser of orange flame erupted from the man's back, turning him into a screaming torch. The formation didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They simply moved around the fallen man and kept coming. Rachel pivoted. The second unit was at 160 meters. She fired again. Another burst of fire, another man down. The third and fourth flamethrower units began to sprint, realizing they were being targeted. They were closing the distance fast. 140 meters, 120. Rachel fired. The third unit went down, the fuel spraying across the snow in a line of liquid fire. The fourth man was smart. He dove behind a rock, using the cover to shield his tank. He was only 100 meters away now. If he reached the 70-meter mark, he could reach the secondary position where Webb was hiding. Rachel waited. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She waited for him to make his move. He did. He surged from behind the rock, his weapon raised, the pilot light flickering like a demon's eye. She didn't aim for the tank this time. She aimed for his head. The shot was true. The man dropped instantly, his weapon falling into the snow and sputtering out. The infantry behind them didn't falter. They were at 80 meters now, and they were beginning to return fire with terrifying accuracy. Rounds were snapping past Rachel's head, the supersonic cracks like whips in the air. She was forced to roll back, the heat from the burning fuel below reaching her even at this distance. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking, not from fear but from the sheer physical toll of the night. Cain, Mercer yelled over the radio. "Flamethrowers are down, but the infantry is at the wire. I see them," she shouted back. Webb, now. From the secondary position, Marcus Webb and his two teammates opened up with everything they had. They were shooting down into the Special Forces element, using the elevation and the rock cover to their advantage. The SAW chattered, a relentless stream of lead that finally forced the Special Forces team to halt their advance. But they didn't retreat. They dug in. The standoff had begun. The ridge was surrounded, the ammo was low, and the elite of the enemy was at the doorstep. Rachel Cain lay in the snow, her body a map of pain, her rifle a cold weight in her hands. She looked up at the dark sky, the snow falling onto her face like cold ash. She thought about the next 60 seconds, and then the 60 after that. She wasn't dead yet, and as long as she was breathing, this ridge belonged to her. The wind over the Alaskan ridge didn't just blow. It screamed, a high-pitched, jagged sound that tore through the layers of Gore-Tex and fleece like they were nothing more than tissue paper. Sergeant Rachel Cain lay pressed into the permafrost, her body a collection of localized agonies that she had carefully compartmentalized into a series of manageable data points. The clock on her heads-up display reads 01:52 hours. It was the dead of a night that felt like it would never end. A sprawling, frozen nightmare where the only light came from the ghost-green flicker of her night vision and the periodic, terrifying blooms of muzzle flashes in the valley below. Beside her, the world was a study in white and gray, a monochromatic landscape of ice and jagged stone. Her boot was wet, a warm, sticky sensation that she knew was blood, but she didn't have the luxury of checking the wound. Somewhere behind her, 40 Special Operations soldiers, the elite of a hostile force, were beginning their ascent. They weren't coming with just rifles and resolve. They were coming with fire. Mercer's voice crackled in her ear, his tone dropping into a register that was lower, more intimate than she had heard from him in the years they'd worked together. It was a lapse in protocol, a moment of raw human concern that felt out of place in the middle of a kill zone. He used her first name, the sound of it cutting through the static like a blade. He asked if she was okay up there. Rachel looked down at her gloved hands, then out at the ridge where the enemy moved like shadows against a darker shadow. She thought about the reality of her situation. A frozen ridge, a bleeding leg, 3 assault elements closing in, and the weight of a dozen lives resting on the stability of her trigger finger. She didn't tell him about the blood or the way the cold was starting to dull her reflexes. She didn't tell him she could feel her heart hammering against the plates of her vest. She simply told him she was functional. In their world, functional was the only metric that mattered. If the machine was still running, the mission was still a go. Mercer didn't push it. He was a professional, and he knew that any further inquiry would only waste breath they didn't have. He gave the order, his voice regaining its steel. All stations were to provide 2 minutes of suppressive fire on the eastern approach on Cain's mark. Webb and Ortega were to dump everything they had into the dark. Rachel watched the enemy through the high-powered optics of her rifle. The Special Operations element was disciplined, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. They were 250 meters out, then 225. She could see the 4 flamethrower operators clearly now. They were the primary threat, the breach tools that would turn their defensive positions into a kiln. Each operator was encased in heavy gear, flanked by 2-man security teams that moved with their weapons up, scanning the ridge with the same intensity she was using to hunt them. Taking them out was a puzzle of sequencing and timing. If she hit the wrong one first, the others would dive for cover and she'd lose her window. She built the kill chain in her mind. The 3rd operator was the most exposed, hovering near the edge of the formation. He'd be the first to fall, then the first, then the second. The 4th was the problem. He was tucked behind a natural rock shelf, shielded from her current angle. To get him, she would have to fire 3 times, then physically drag herself 15 meters to the left while the world exploded around her, find the 4th man, and drop him before his security team could pinpoint her signature. It was a plan that relied on seconds she didn't have and a body that was already failing her. At 200 meters, she whispered the word, "Mark." The ridge erupted. It wasn't a firefight. It was a physical assault on the senses. Every American weapon on the eastern face opened up at once. The SAW machine guns chattered in long, screaming bursts, and the personal rifles added a rhythmic, percussive undercurrent to the roar. The noise was enormous, a wall of sound that hit the advancing enemy element like a physical blow. Muzzle flashes lit up the falling snow, turning the blizzard into a strobe-lit hellscape. The fire wasn't accurate. It wasn't meant to be. Its sole purpose was to blind the enemy, to overwhelm their sensors and break the clarity of the drone feed that was circling overhead like a vulture. Rachel moved into the chaos. She tuned out the roar of the SAW and the whistling of incoming rounds, focusing entirely on the rhythmic expansion and contraction of her own lungs. She found the 3rd flamethrower operator in her crosshairs. The man was a silhouette against the snow. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, a familiar, sharp kick. The operator crumpled. She didn't wait to see him hit the ground. She shifted right, the scope sweeping across the frantic movement of the enemy line. Breathe, 1st operator down. The security teams were reacting now, diving for cover and trying to orient themselves toward the source of the precision fire, but the suppressive barrage from the ridge was too thick. The drone above, struggling with the heat bloom of a dozen weapons, couldn't isolate her position. 2nd operator down. Now came the hard part. Rachel pushed off the ground, her knees screaming in protest. The movement was clunky, hampered by the injury to her leg and the sheer weight of her gear. She stayed low, dragging herself 15 meters along the jagged lip of the ridge. Every inch was a battle against the terrain. She reached her new position, her breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged her mask. She found the 4th operator through the scope. The man was smart. He'd gone prone and was belly-crawling toward a deeper crevice in the rocks. She tracked him, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She didn't fire while he was moving. She waited for the pause. It was a universal human trait. Even the best-trained soldiers paused for a fraction of a second when they thought they'd reached a point of safety. He reached the crevice, his shoulders relaxing for a heartbeat as he prepared to tuck himself away. Rachel fired. The man went still. 4 flamethrower operators, all down. "Ceasefire," she breathed into the radio. "Ceasefire on the eastern approach." The American guns fell silent. For a strange, ringing second, the ridge was almost quiet. The only sounds were the howling wind and the metallic pinging of hot barrels cooling in the sub-zero air. Rachel lay there, her heart thudding in her ears, waiting for the enemy to break. But they didn't. These weren't conscripts or mercenaries. They were the best the opposing force had to offer. They didn't retreat. They didn't panic. They simply adjusted. Mercer's voice came back, tight and controlled, vibrating with a new level of tension. "They're still moving, Cain. They are still moving." "I know," she replied. She was already back behind the glass, her mind working through the formation with the cold, detached logic of a computer. If she couldn't break their tools, she would break their brain. She began targeting the command structure. First, the officers, identified by their positioning and the way the others looked to them for cues. Then the NCOs, the backbone of the unit, the men whose barked orders kept the machine running when the plan went to hell. It was a brutal, clinical calculation. She found the man she assessed to be the element commander, a figure at the rear who was managing the radio traffic and directing the flow of the assault with sharp, decisive gestures. She took the shot. The man fell, and for the first time the formation hesitated. It wasn't a stop, just a momentary stutter in their momentum, a gap of 8 seconds. Rachel used every one of those seconds. She worked the gaps, picking off the men who tried to step up and fill the void. The formation's discipline began to fray at the edges. Spacing became uneven. The rhythmic leapfrogging advance turned into a staggered, confused crawl. 30 meters from the base of the ridge, the element finally stopped. They didn't run, but they went to ground, digging into the snow and establishing a base of fire while the surviving leaders tried to reorganize. "They're pinned at the base," Rachel reported, her voice flat. 100 meters below the ridge. They're reorganizing. I estimate 8 to 12 minutes before they push again. In the sudden lull, the silence felt heavier than the noise had. Rachel could hear her own shallow breathing, the sound echoing inside her cold-weather gear. Ortega's voice broke the quiet, sounding like a man who had just witnessed a miracle and didn't know whether to cheer or pray. "Cain, how many rounds did you just fire in the last 3 minutes?" She checked her internal count instinctively. 14. 14 rounds, Ortega repeated, his voice hushed. 14 rounds against 40 Special Forces soldiers, and they stopped. "They didn't stop," Rachel corrected him, her eyes never leaving the scope. "They reorganized. There's a difference. We have 8 minutes. "Right," Ortega said. There was a long pause. "I'm going to take those 8 minutes to think about my career choices." A ghost of a smile flickered across Rachel's face, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The reprieve was interrupted by Danny. His voice was different, tighter, higher, carrying the specific, brittle pitch of someone who was holding back a flood of bad news. He told her he was at the medical bunker and that the senior medic needed to speak with her. A new voice took over the channel. It was Staff Sergeant Prentice, a man whose voice carried the weariness of 1,000 miles and 100 battlefields. He told her he had 7 patients in the bunker. 2 of them were critical. They wouldn't survive being moved, and they certainly wouldn't survive if the ridge was breached. He was blunt, his words stripped of any tactical jargon. He told her that those 2 men were alive only because of what she had done in the last 3 hours, and that their lives now rested entirely on her. "I understand," Rachel said. "I don't think you do," Prentice countered, his voice not unkind but incredibly heavy. "I'm not talking about tactics or holding the line. I'm telling you that I have never in 17 years as a medic put everything on one person like this. And I am putting it all on you right now, everything." The weight of it settled into Rachel's chest, a physical pressure that seemed to rival the cold. She closed her eyes for 1 full second, allowing herself to feel the scale of the burden. 7 patients, 12 soldiers on the ridge, a single rifle, a single shooter. The entire outcome of the night balanced on the edge of her ability to remain perfect. She opened her eyes. The world was still dark, still frozen, and still hostile. "Tell your patients to hold on," she said. "Tell them the ridge isn't falling tonight." She clicked off the radio and began her work. She had 6 minutes left. She used 3 of them for a meticulous equipment check. Her rifle was hot. She could feel the heat radiating off the barrel, a shimmering distortion in her thermal view. She checked her ammunition, counting the remaining rounds with a sinking feeling. She was low, lower than she had ever been in an active engagement. Then she performed a physical inventory of herself. She did it clinically, as if she were inspecting a damaged piece of hardware. Left leg, functional but painful, slowing her repositioning by 2 or 3 seconds. Acceptable. Left forearm, manageable, though the muscle tremors were affecting her stability. She adjusted her rest to compensate. Acceptable. Right shoulder, the worst. A fragment from an earlier mortar blast had torn into the muscle at an angle that made every movement a searing jolt of lightning. She had use of the arm, but the pain was consuming a portion of her brain that should have been dedicated to targeting. Not acceptable, but unavoidable. She didn't report any of this to Mercer. There was no point. He couldn't fix her shoulder, and knowing she was failing would only compromise his own decision-making. Instead, she asked for an ammunition status across the line. The news wasn't good. Ortega was down to his last belts. Webb was slightly better, but they were all redlining. "We need to make every shot count," Rachel said. "Suppressive fire only if I call it. Single-aimed shots only. Do not waste rounds on targets I can engage from Overwatch." "Copy," Mercer said. "And Lieutenant," Rachel added, "the 3rd drone is still up there. When they push again, they're going to use it to range their mortars on my position. I saw them repositioning in the valley 15 minutes ago. I'm going to have mortars and an assault element hitting me simultaneously. I need you to know that." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Mercer knew what she was saying. If the mortars found their mark, she would be gone and the Overwatch would collapse. "What do you need?" he asked. "Nothing you can give me," she said. I just need you to know so that if my radio goes quiet, you don't wait for orders from me. Ortega takes over Overwatch coordination. Rachel, don't talk like that, Mercer began. I'm not being fatalistic, Lieutenant. I'm being a professional. If I go down, the plan has to continue. That's just planning. A long pause followed, finally broken by Ortega. I heard you, Cain, and for the record, I plan on not needing that information. Me too, she said. The clock hit 02:14 hours. The 8 minutes were up. The enemy didn't come in a wave this time. They came in 2 parallel columns, using the natural rock formations on either side of the eastern approach for cover. It was a sophisticated leapfrog maneuver, one column providing cover fire while the other moved, then switching. It was designed specifically to negate a single sniper's advantage. If she engaged one, the other would advance. She had 3 seconds to decide how to break the rhythm. She couldn't stop both, so she wouldn't try. She would hit the left column with such violence and speed that they would break, forcing the right column to hesitate. In that hesitation, she would pivot. She went into it with a ferocity she'd never used in the field. She fired at the absolute edge of her mechanical limit, the bolt of her rifle cycling in a blur of precision. Left column, 5 shots, 16 seconds, 4 men down, 1 likely wounded. The column halted, the survivors scrambling for better cover. The right column, seeing their counterparts decimated, stuttered for a heartbeat. Rachel pivoted, her rifle swinging across the ridge. She put 3 rounds into the lead elements of the right column, stopping them in their tracks. Then the world turned white. A mortar round slammed into the ridge 4 meters to her right. The concussion was a physical hammer, throwing her sideways. Her rifle was wrenched from its rest, her scope slammed against a rock, and a jagged, white-hot explosion of pain flared in her shoulder as the previous injury was torn wide open. She lay face down in the snow for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, there was no mission, no ridge, and no enemy. There was only the ringing in her ears and the terrifying, cold sensation of the rock against her cheek. Cain, Cain, answer me, Cain. Danny's voice was screaming in her ear, raw with a terror that finally broke through her stupor. She pushed herself up. Her right arm felt like it belonged to someone else, a heavy, useless weight that refused to follow her commands. She used her left hand to lever herself back toward the rifle, dragging her body through the slush. I'm up, she rasped. You went quiet, we thought. I'm up, she repeated, her voice gaining strength. That was all that mattered. She got her eye back to the scope. The world was blurry, her vision swimming with dark spots, but she forced herself to focus. Her shoulder was gone, not physically, but functionally. The nervous system was sending out a constant scream of stop, but she ignored it. She shifted her entire shooting posture, moving the rifle to her left side and wedging her body against a rock to create an artificial stability. It was an emergency position, something she'd practiced once in a training camp years ago. It was awkward, painful, and far from ideal, but it worked. She fired. 2 more men from the right column went down. They retreated back into the shadows of the base. Mortar team in the valley, Mercer warned. They're ranging you. They're going to fire again. I know, Rachel said. I need to move. Status on the columns. Left is regrouping at the base. Right is pinned. But Cain, I've got a 4th element. They're appearing on the eastern sensors coming from the far ridge. They are above you. Rachel went perfectly still, above her. It was a classic move, one she should have anticipated. They must have been inserted hours ago, long before the first shot was fired, waiting in the high peaks for the moment the defenders were fully engaged. They were coming down from the summit, effectively trapping her between the frontal assault and the high ground. How many? She asked. Sensor shows 8, maybe 10 signatures. They're moving fast, 10 minutes from your position. The math was simple and devastating. If she stayed where she was, she would be pinned from above and overrun from below. The ridge would fall, the medical bunker would be purged, and the mission would end in a slaughter. Mercer, she said, her voice dropping into a calm that was almost eerie. I'm leaving the Overwatch position. What? Cain, where are you going? I'm going up, she said. I'm taking the high ground before they get there. If I stay here, we're dead. If I move up, I can maintain the angle on both threats. Cain, there's no cover up there. The summit shelf is a shooting gallery. There's a rock lip at the summit. I've been eyeing it all night. It's a risk, but it's the only move we have left. It's not a tactical choice, Lieutenant. It's math. She didn't wait for his approval. She was already moving. She climbed the ridge in the pitch black, her fingers digging into the frozen stone, her torn shoulder a constant, throbbing reminder of her mortality. The blizzard was her only shield. The mortar team in the valley saw her movement signature on the drone feed and began to fire. the rounds exploding on the slopes below her, sending showers of ice and shrapnel into the air. She reached the summit shelf at 02:31 hours. She threw herself behind the jagged lip of rock and brought her rifle up. Below her, the high ground element was closer than Mercer had estimated, only 15 meters away and moving in a tight, disciplined column. They were 40 seconds from her position. She settled the rifle. The pain in her shoulder had reached a volume that she could no longer suppress. It was a roar that threatened to drown out her focus. She cataloged it, acknowledged it, and then pushed it into a dark corner of her mind. She breathed. She took the lead man at 30 meters. The shot was close, uncomfortably so for a sniper, but the rock lip provided a vital barrier. The man dropped silently. The second man reacted with terrifying speed, diving for cover before Rachel could cycle the bolt. These weren't just soldiers, they were shadows disappearing into the darkness and the crags of the summit. "Cain, report." Mercer's voice was a frantic whisper. "High element is in cover," she said. 7 remaining, they're spreading out. I need 60 seconds. "You don't have 60. The frontal assault just pushed again, there at the base of the ridge. Ortega is down to his last belt. He's got maybe 90 seconds of fire left." Rachel didn't let the panic in. She processed the numbers. 90 seconds, 2 minutes if he was lucky. "Tell Ortega to hold the belt," she commanded. "Don't fire yet. I need the frontal assault to commit to the climb. If he fires now, they'll just wait him out. Tell him to wait. He's not going to like that, Cain. Tell him anyway." She turned back to the problem in front of her. The high element had gone quiet, shifting from an assault to a containment strategy. They were waiting for her to be distracted by the climb below so they could move in and finish her. It was a pincer, and it was closing. She used the silence of the mortars to her advantage. She couldn't see the remaining men through the snow, but she could hear them. She waited, her ear pressed near the stone. There, the sound of a boot scraping against ice, a tiny, insignificant sound that would have been lost to anyone else. She adjusted her aim 4 inches to the left. She waited for the sound to repeat. When it did, she fired, 6 remaining. The response was immediate and disciplined. 2 of the men opened up on her position, bracketing the rock lip with precise, aimed fire. They weren't spraying, they were pinning her, forcing her to keep her head down while the others flanked her. 20 seconds passed. Each one felt like an hour. Below her, the frontal assault was gaining ground. Above her, the circle was tightening. She made a decision that would have failed her any qualification exam in the world. She didn't stay behind cover. She stood up. She rose over the rock lip, exposing her head and shoulders to the storm. She had 4 seconds. She identified 2 of the muzzle flashes in the dark and fired twice. 1 man went down hard, the other disappeared into the rocks. She dropped back down just as a hail of return fire chipped the stone where her head had been. Her shoulder made a sickening sound as she hit the ground. The tear had worsened, the joint now sliding in a way that made her stomach churn. She was losing the arm. She could feel the strength draining out of her fingers, the grip on her rifle becoming a tenuous thing. "Cain!" The voice didn't come from the radio, it came from the darkness behind her. She spun, her handgun clearing its holster before her brain had even fully processed the threat. "Don't shoot, it's me." Danny scrambled over the ledge, his face pale and caked with frost. He was carrying a heavy bag of ammunition, his breathing a series of ragged, panicked gasps. "I told you to stay in the bunker," Rachel hissed, though the sight of the ammunition was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Prentice has web now," Danny said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I counted your rounds. I knew you were empty. I came up the west side. There's a blind approach the sensors aren't picking up." Rachel's tactical mind immediately seized on the information. A blind approach. If Danny could get up it, so could the enemy. "Danny, listen to me. I need you to go back to that approach. If they find it, they'll come up behind us and the ridge is gone. You have a rifle." "I qualified expert," Danny said, and for the first time that night, he didn't sound like a kid. He sounded like a soldier who had reached the end of his fear and found something harder underneath. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm covering the west." Rachel looked at him for a heartbeat, then nodded. "Stay low. Don't fire until they are on top of you. And Danny, thank you." He disappeared back into the shadows of the western shelf. Rachel turned her attention back to the frontal assault. The pincer was almost shut. The enemy below was 50 meters from the crest. Webb was out of ammunition. Ortega was holding his final belt, waiting for her word. She clicked her radio to the command channel. "Webb, you still with me?" "I'm here, Sergeant." The boy's voice came back, thin and trembling. "You've held that line for 3 hours, Marcus. You know what that means." "No, Sergeant." It means you already did the hard part. Everything from here is just finishing. You have 22 rounds left. Make them count. Pick the most dangerous target and don't fire until you can see the color of their gear. You hear me? I hear you. Rachel took a breath, the cold air burning her throat. She looked at the summit, then down at the valley, then back at her rifle. The barrel was glowing, her body was broken, and the odds were impossible. It was exactly where she was meant to be. "Mercer," she said, "tell Ortega to open up. Everything we have, right now." The plan was a suicide note written in the language of ballistics and desperation. Rachel Cain felt the freezing wind clawing at her skin, a relentless, biting force that sought to numb her senses and slow her heartbeat. Below her, the mountain was a jagged landscape of shadows and muzzle flashes, a chaotic theater where the survival of her entire platoon rested on a sliver of time so thin it barely seemed real. 45 seconds. That was the window. It wasn't just a tactical estimate. It was a countdown to either salvation or a shallow grave in the permafrost. She looked down at the last belt of ammunition, the brass casings gleaming dully in the low light, each one a promise of violence. She knew the rate of fire would be devastating. Ortega would open up, a continuous, roaring stream of lead directed straight into the maw of the frontal assault, a desperate gamble to pin them down. He would burn through that belt in less than a minute, his barrel glowing cherry red in the dark, and in that brief, hellish cacopoeia, Rachel had to do the impossible. She needed the assault to halt its upward momentum for 45 seconds while Ortega provided the distraction. That was the sum total of their hope. When Mercer asked what she could possibly achieve in such a narrow window, her voice was steady, despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. She told him she would clear the high element and return to Overwatch. It sounded simple when spoken into a radio, a clean sequence of events, but the reality was a jagged mess of geometry and blood. The radio went silent, a heavy, oppressive pause that stretched out for 3 long seconds. Rachel counted them, her thumb brushing against the cold steel of her rifle. When Mercer finally spoke again, his voice lacked the usual steel of command authority. There was no tactical assessment in his tone, no weighing of probabilities. Instead, there was something deeply, rawly human. He wasn't just her commanding officer in that moment. He was a man staring into the abyss, asking her to be the bridge across it. He didn't say the words, but she heard them nonetheless. "Tell me you can do this." She thought of Eastern Europe. She thought of the 5 men who had stayed behind in a rain-slicked forest, their faces blurred by time, but their sacrifice etched into her soul. She thought of the decision she had made then, a choice that had haunted her for 3 years, a weight she carried every time she closed her eyes. Then she heard the voice of Prentice, the medic, echoing in her mind, telling her that he was putting everything on her. The lives in the medical bunker, the wounded, the weary, the terrified, they were all resting on the strength of her trigger finger. She didn't hesitate. She told Mercer she could do it. She told him with a certainty that she forced into existence through sheer willpower. 90 seconds, he replied. Go. The world narrowed down to the optics of her rifle and the rhythm of her own labored breathing. She didn't move toward the enemy's expected line of fire. Instead, she pushed off the lip of the ridge in a direction the high element wasn't covering. For the last 4 minutes, while the battle raged below, she had been a ghost, mapping their positions with a cold, analytical precision. She knew where they were looking, and more importantly, she knew where they weren't. They had assumed the dead ground created by the summit shelf's geometry was impassable. They thought the mountain itself was their flank. They were wrong. Rachel Cain was using the dead ground. She began a low crawl around the left side of the shelf, her body pressed against the frozen earth. Her shoulder was no longer just an injury. It was a screaming, white-hot entity that demanded her attention. Her leg burned with a dull, throbbing heat, a constant reminder of the shrapnel it held. But she pushed those sensations down, relegating them to a distant part of her consciousness. They were irrelevant. What mattered were the 4 men above her and the 45 seconds of chaos Ortega was about to unleash. She found the first man not by his silhouette, but by the faint, ghostly glow of his thermal optic. He was a predator waiting for the kill, his eyes fixed on the ridge below, anticipating the moment of the breach. He wasn't watching the dead ground to his left because, in his training and his tactical reality, nobody came from the dead ground. He was a professional, disciplined, and focused, and that focus was his undoing. Rachel was 6 meters away when she fired. The sound of her rifle was swallowed by the sudden, volcanic roar of Ortega's machine gun opening up on the ridge below. The two sounds merged into a singular, jarring event, creating a moment of total auditory confusion for the remaining 3 soldiers of the high element. The world had exploded around them, and for 2 critical seconds, they were paralyzed by a lack of information. They didn't know which direction the primary threat was coming from, and in combat, 2 seconds is an eternity. Rachel didn't give them a chance to recover. She provided them with another piece of lethal, incomplete information. She moved 10 meters to the right, a shadow among shadows, and fired again. The second man was still trying to orient himself toward the first shot, his weapon transitioning to a ghost when her round found him. 2 down. The remaining 2 were different. They were better. They hadn't panicked. They had processed the threat and reacted. They dove for cover, their movements fluid and practiced, and began watching multiple directions simultaneously. She could hear them over the wind, short, clipped radio bursts in a language she didn't understand, but the tone was universal. It was the sound of professional soldiers realizing they were being hunted. The urgency in their voices told her the clock was ticking. They were reporting to their command, seeking instructions. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the situation evolved into something even more dangerous. Instead of retreating to the safety of the distance, Rachel did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She closed the gap. The psychology of a sniper is built on space and precision, on the safety of the long-range kill. By moving toward them, she was violating the fundamental rules of her own tradecraft. She was betting everything that they were still thinking in terms of countering a sniper, not a soldier who had decided to turn a mountain peak into a close-quarters kill zone. She rounded a jagged outcrop at a distance of only 4 meters. The man was there. He was fast, genuinely military-grade fast. He got his weapon up, his eyes widening as he registered her presence, but Rachel was already firing. The air pressure of his return shot passed so close to her head that it felt like a physical blow, a sudden gust of mortality before she ducked back behind the rock. 1 left. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It wasn't fear. It was the pure physiological cost of 4 hours of sustained combat while navigating 3 major injuries. She was running on fumes, her body a map of pain and exhaustion, but her mind remained a cold, calculating machine. She could hear the last man moving. He wasn't fleeing. He was repositioning, trying to find a new angle with a patience that marked him as the best of the group. The best ones are always the last to die. She forced herself to breathe, to slow the internal tempo of her mind even as the world outside stayed at a frantic pace. She thought about the geometry of the shelf, the specific angles of the summit she had memorized. He was moving toward the west approach, toward Danny. She keyed her radio, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She told Danny he was coming. She told him not to let the man reach the approach. There was a pause, a single, frozen breath of silence. Then Danny Alcaffer, a boy who had never fired a weapon in live combat until tonight, a boy who had spent the first hour of the battle paralyzed by the sheer scale of the violence, spoke. "I see him," he said. A single shot rang out from the west. Then silence. Rachel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Report," she commanded. Another pause followed, longer this time. "He's down," Danny finally said. His voice was a strange, haunting mixture of sounds, the tightness of a man who had just crossed an irrevocable line, and the flat, hollow tone of someone who understood that he had no other choice. "He's down, Sergeant Cain." When she asked if he was okay, he said yes, but she didn't fully believe him. No one is ever okay after the first time, but there would be time for counseling later. Right now, there was only the mission. "Stay on the approach," she ordered. "Don't move." She was already transitioning back to the edge of the summit shelf, her rifle finding its home against her shoulder as she looked back down at the ridge. Ortega's gun had fallen silent 60 seconds ago, its final belt spent. The enemy had used that silence to push with a renewed, desperate energy. They were at the crest now, lead elements physically occupying the ridge, fighting through the final American defensive positions. The radio was a cacophony of disaster. Reyes was reporting multiple hostiles in the east section, his voice strained by the chaos of close-quarters contact. Webb was out of ammunition, his voice crackling with a frantic, high-pitched energy. Mercer was giving the order to fall back to the secondary positions. And then there was Prentice in the medical bunker, saying nothing at all. All she could hear was his breathing, the heavy, rhythmic sound of a man who had done everything within his power and was now simply waiting to see if it would be enough to keep his patients alive. Rachel fired. 3 shots, 3 targets down. The lead element of the assault, sensing the sudden, lethal precision from above, halted their push and scrambled for cover. It bought 10 seconds. In the world of the ridge, 10 seconds was an eternity. It was enough time for Rays to drag 2 wounded men back from the forward line. It was enough for Webb to reach the secondary position, discarding his empty rifle and scavenging a sidearm from a fallen comrade. It was enough. She fired again and then again, working through the assault element with a cold, mechanical efficiency. Every round was a calculated investment. There were no wasted shots. Before every pull of the trigger, she ran the same internal sequence she had been using for 6 hours. Find the target, read the wind, control the breath, fire. The assault didn't retreat, but it stalled. They were pinned down, unable to advance because every time a soldier moved, Rachel Cain found him from the high ground. The character of the enemy's radio traffic began to change. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It had shifted from the confident coordination of an assault to something defensive, something riddled with doubt. They were questioning their command, asking what to do about the phantom on the summit who refused to die. Then a voice broke through the open frequency, speaking in accented but clear English. It was a deliberate choice, intended for every man on that mountain to understand without the delay of translation. "Find the woman on the ridge," the voice commanded. "Take her alive." The words sent a shiver through her that wasn't fear or anger. It was something older, something cleaner. It was the clarity that comes when you realize you have become the primary obstacle to an enemy's victory. To be wanted alive meant she was doing her job far too well. She keyed her radio to Mercer. "They just ordered their men to take me alive," she said. There was a pause as Mercer processed this. "Is that good or bad?" he asked. "It means they've decided I'm worth more as a capture than a kill," she replied. "It means they're more afraid of what I'm doing than what I might know." She explained that the next phase would prioritize capture, which meant they would try to maneuver around her rather than simply trying to suppress her with fire. This changed the entire threat profile for the platoon. Mercer asked what she needed. She looked down at her remaining ammunition. The count was low, dangerously low. It was the number she had been dreading, the point where every single round had to be a turning point. "I need you to know I have a limited number of shots remaining," she said. She refused to give him the exact count because he didn't need that burden. He needed to focus on his line. She told him to hold the secondary position and to trust her. Mercer's voice changed then. It was the voice of a man who had seen his understanding of human endurance rewritten over the course of a single night. "Tell me what you need and I will find it," he said. "You can't give me what I need from down there," she replied. "Just hold the line." She turned her focus back to the ridge. The enemy was moving, splitting into 2 groups. One was pushing north along the ridge, the other south. A classic pincer movement designed to bracket her position and eliminate her angles. If they reached their objectives, she would be caught in a crossfire with no escape. She had to break one of the groups before they could set up. She chose the northern group, 7 men moving with a discipline that was marred by a slight, frantic edge. They were moving too fast, which suggested a time constraint she didn't yet understand. She worked through them in 40 seconds, 3 confirmed kills. The remaining 4 hit the dirt, their morale finally fracturing under the weight of the night's losses. She heard one of them over the radio, a voice asking a question that surely started with the word why. Why was she still there? Why were they still dying? She didn't wait to find out. She pivoted to the southern group. They had used her focus on the north to advance further than she had anticipated. They were close, only 30 meters from a position that would give them a clear shot at her shelf. She had to move. Despite the agony in her shoulder and the leaden weight of her leg, she pulled back from the lip and scrambled 10 meters across the shelf to a secondary feature. It was poor cover, shallow and exposed on the right, but it gave her the angle she needed. She fired, 2 more down. The group scattered, but one soldier had managed to flank her, his shot chipping the rock just inches from her hand. She felt the sting of stone fragments on her knuckles, but she didn't flinch. She kept her hands on the rifle, found the angle, and fired. The shooting from that direction ceased. She was gasping for air again, her body trembling from the sheer physical toll. Then Danny's voice came over the radio, quiet and steady. "Sergeant Cain, I've got movement below the west approach. 3 men moving slow. They don't know I'm here." She closed her eyes for a second, a brief moment of respite. It was either a new element or survivors regrouping. "Don't fire until the lead man is 20 meters out," she told him. "And Danny, move as soon as you fire. Don't stay in the same spot." "Copy," he replied. She watched the ridge looking for the signs of the next push, but the enemy was consolidating. They were tired. They were running low on operational capacity, their spirit ground down by 6 hours of relentless resistance. Then Mercer's voice came through, hushed and heavy with news. "Rachel, I just got word. Reinforcements are 40 minutes out. The weather cleared. Helicopters are in the air, 40 minutes. It was a number that felt both incredibly short and impossibly long. It was a finite goal, something they could finally measure their survival against. She asked about the platoon. Mercer's report was somber. 2 men hadn't survived the breach. 4 more were severely wounded. Reyes was fighting through an arm wound, and Ortega was down to his rifle. 7 effectives plus Rachel. 8 people standing between the enemy and the medical bunker. 40 minutes, she repeated. "Tell the platoon. Everyone holds for 40 minutes and then we go home." She heard the responses ripple through the net. Reyes, Webb, Ortega, Danny, each voice a testament to the stubborn human will to survive. Finally, Prentice spoke from the bunker. He didn't talk about tactics or ammunition. He simply asked Mercer to tell Sergeant Cain thank you. Rachel didn't respond. She couldn't. She was already back on the scope, managing her final rounds with the precision of a diamond cutter. The final push began at 0308 hours. It wasn't a frontal assault, but a flanking maneuver through a tight, difficult route between the shelf and the northern ridge. She found them at 25 meters. 3 shots, the approach was closed. At 0317, a survivor of the frontal assault tried to exploit a gap in the southern line. Rachel saw it happening, saw the 60-second window of disaster. She had 8 rounds left. She used 5. The gap closed. 3 rounds remained. She held them like a holy relic. She held them through the long silence that followed, through the distant, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors that began to vibrate in the air. She held them as Danny reported the west approach clear, and Reyes confirmed his sector was holding. 3 rounds for the thing that mattered most. At 0329, a single soldier appeared at the base of the path leading to the bunker. He was a scout or perhaps a lone survivor who had decided to finish the mission himself. He was 40 meters out, unaware of the ghost above. Rachel fired once. The man went down, 2 rounds left. At 0341, the helicopters arrived. The sound was a physical presence, a roaring, overwhelming force that signaled the end of the long night. The radio exploded with activity as Mercer coordinated the extraction. Rachel stayed on the shelf. She watched the approaches, her finger still near the trigger, holding those last 2 rounds until every wounded man was safely on a bird. This was her ridge, and she would be the last to leave it. Finally, Mercer's voice came through one last time, cracked with emotion. "Rachel, everyone is loaded. All wounded are on the birds. We're ready for you." She looked at the 2 rounds in her hand. She looked at the mountain, at the frozen terrain where so much had been lost and so much had been saved. She loaded the rounds back into the magazine, set her rifle down with a tenderness that bordered on the sacred, and began the climb. Halfway down, her shoulder finally gave out. She slid the remaining distance on her back, coming to a halt at the base of the shelf, staring up at a sky filled with snow and the flashing lights of the rescue craft. Danny was there. He didn't say a word, just hauled her up, his shoulder supporting her weight. They walked toward the helicopters together. 40 meters from the extraction point, Rachel stopped. She looked back at the ridge, a silent sentinel in the dark. It had held. The thing she had given everything to defend was still standing. She looked at it for 3 seconds, then turned and kept walking. The helicopter touched down in Anchorage as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. Rachel was conscious for the landing, her eyes tracking the movements of the flight crew, but she was gone before they even cleared the hospital doors. It wasn't just the blood loss, though the medic had spent every drop of his emergency supply on her during the flight. It was the total, systemic collapse of a body that had been pushed far beyond its breaking point. She had stayed awake through the fire and the cold, through the pain and the loss, and now that the mission was over, her body simply stopped. She drifted into a dark, quiet place where the wind didn't bite and the radio stayed silent. She spent 4 hours in surgery. The fragment from the mortar had done catastrophic damage to her shoulder, tearing the rotator cuff, chipping the bone, and leaving a trail of ruined tissue. The surgeon would later marvel at the fact that she had continued to fire a precision rifle for hours with such an injury. It defied medical logic. Her leg was cleaned, the shrapnel removed, and her other various wounds catalogued and treated. When she finally woke up on the afternoon of the second day, the world was white and sterile. The smell of antiseptic replaced the scent of cordite. She recognized the ceiling immediately, the cold, institutional glow of a military hospital. She turned her head, a slow and painful movement, and saw Danny Alcaffer. He was asleep in the chair beside her bed, still wearing his stained combat uniform. He looked exhausted, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle, a half-eaten protein bar still clutched in his hand. She watched him for a moment, seeing the boy who had become a man on that west approach. "Danny," she whispered. He was awake instantly, his eyes snapping open with the sharp alertness of a soldier. He saw her and his face transformed, a complex wave of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "You're awake," he said, his voice thick. "Tell me about the ridge," she said. Danny sat forward, his eyes bright. "Everyone made it," he told her. "All 7 wounded, even the 2 critical patients Prentice was worried about. Every American soldier came home." Rachel closed her eyes, the weight of those words pressing into her. The ridge had held. The sacrifice hadn't been in vain. She asked about Ray's and was told he was recovering, his constant talking seen as a nuisance by the nurses but a victory by the doctors. She asked about Webb. Danny hesitated, then told her that Webb was fine, though quiet. He had a message for her, 60 seconds works. Rachel knew exactly what that meant. She knew the cost of that lesson, and she knew she would have to speak to him later to help him navigate the lifetime of seconds that would follow. Finally, she asked about Ortega. Danny smiled a tired, genuine smile. "Ortega is fine," he said, and deeply, profoundly annoyed that he had to leave his machine gun behind. Rachel lay back against the pillows, the hum of the hospital a distant, peaceful sound. The battle was over. The mountain was behind them. She felt the heavy pull of sleep returning, but this time, it wasn't the darkness of collapse. It was the quiet, hard-earned rest of a soldier who had held the line when everything else had fallen. She let her eyes close, the image of the ridge fading into the white light of the room, knowing that for the first time in a very long time, she was finally safe. The hospital room smelled of sterile citrus and the sharp, underlying tang of iodine. It was a cold, efficient scent that did little to mask the heavy, institutional weight of the building. Rachel lay still, her body feeling like it had been disassembled and put back together with rusted parts. Every breath was a conscious effort, a slow expansion of a ribcage that felt as though it had been squeezed in a vise. Outside the window, the Alaskan sky was a bruised purple, the sun dipping low but never quite disappearing, a constant reminder of the strange, timeless world she had just returned from. Danny sat in the chair beside her bed. It was one of those uncomfortable, vinyl-covered things designed to discourage long stays, yet he looked as though he had grown into it. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red and his posture slumped in a way that spoke of a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could quickly fix. He had been talking for a while, a steady stream of updates that served as an anchor to the world of the living. "Ortega's still annoyed about his machine gun," Danny said, a small, tired ghost of a smile touching his lips. "He says he wants it on record that he would have held the eastern approach longer if command had given him more ammunition belts. He told me to tell you that specifically. He thinks if it's in the official report, maybe they'll finally listen to his requests for a higher basic load." Rachel managed a small, pained huff of air that might have been a laugh in another life. "That sounds right," she said, her voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Ortega always did think the solution to every problem in life was more belts of 7.62. He'd try to stop a tidal wave with a sustained burst if you let him." Danny nodded, his gaze dropping to his boots, which were cleaned of the ridge's mud but still bore the scuffs of the scramble. The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the monitoring equipment. Then, Danny's voice shifted. It lost the light, conversational tone of soldierly griping and took on a weight that made Rachel turn her head toward him, despite the protest of her neck muscles. "And Prentice," Danny said. "Prentice came out here this morning. He sat in that chair for 2 hours before I got here. He didn't leave a message. He didn't ask for the nurses to wake you. He just sat here, staring at the wall for 2 hours, and then he stood up and went back to his patients." Rachel absorbed this quietly. The image of the medic, usually a whirlwind of frantic, focused energy, sitting in absolute silence was jarring. She thought about Prentice's voice on the radio during the worst of the third assault on the ridge. She remembered the static, the sound of mortar fire in the background, and the raw, uncharacteristic desperation in his tone. "I am putting everything on you right now. Everything. She thought about what it cost a man like Prentice to say those words. He was a medic. His entire professional identity, his very soul, was built around the belief that he was the one who kept people alive. He was the barrier between the soldier and the grave. For him to say out loud that the keeping was in someone else's hands, that he was powerless and that her rifle was the only thing standing between his patients and the end, was a confession of a profound kind. She'd carry that too. She had been carrying things for a long time. She had a room in her mind, a dark, quiet space filled with the things she had picked up over the years and never quite found a way to set down. There was plenty of space in there for Prentice's words. "Danny," she said softly, breaking the silence. "How are you?" The question caught him off guard. He flinched slightly, as if she had reached out and touched a wound he hadn't realized was open. She watched the flicker of expressions cross his face as he decided whether to give her the easy, military answer or the real one. He looked at the floor, then at the Roman IV bag dripping steadily above her, and finally he gave her the truth. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I keep going back to the West Approach, to that moment when the first wave hit. I knew what I had to do and I did it. I didn't hesitate. It was the right thing, and I understand why we did it. I understand the tactics, the necessity, the whole thing." He stopped, his throat working as he swallowed hard. But understanding why doesn't make it simple. It doesn't make the images stop. "No," Rachel said, her heart aching for the young soldier. "It doesn't, it never does." Danny looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a map through the wilderness he now found himself in. "Does it get simpler?" he asked. It was the same question he'd asked her at the start of the night, before the first shot was fired, back when he was a soldier who had never been in combat, and she was the one who carried the weight of having been in too much of it. "The understanding gets deeper," Rachel said, choosing her words with the same precision she used for a long-distance shot. "That's different from simpler. Simpler implies that the edges get smoothed off, that it becomes easy to digest. It doesn't, but you start to understand the geography of it. You learn where the pitfalls are. You learn how to walk with the weight instead of letting it crush you. It's something, Danny. It's not peace, but it's something." Danny nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He seemed to take a measure of comfort in her honesty. He didn't want platitudes. He wanted to know the truth of the road ahead. "Can I ask you something?" he asked after a long pause. "Yes. On the summit shelf, when you came over the lip completely exposed, when you went up that ridge with the mortar team already ranging in on you and the shells were walking closer with every second." He paused, his breath hitching. "Were you scared then?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She let the memory of the cold wind and the smell of cordite wash over her. She remembered the way the world had shrunk down to the size of her scope, the way her heartbeat had felt like a drum in her ears. She thought about the honest answer, the one she owed him. "Yes," she said, "every time." Danny frowned slightly. "You didn't sound it on the radio. You sounded like you were ordering a coffee. You sounded like you were bored." "I told you a long time ago," she said, a ghost of a tired smirk appearing. "Sounding scared doesn't help anything. Fear is a passenger, Danny. You can't kick it out of the car, but you damn sure don't let it drive. You learn to talk over it." He was quiet for a long moment, processing that. Then he said something she didn't expect, something that pierced through her professional armor in a way the mortar fragments hadn't. "You kept us alive," he said, his voice steady and thick with conviction. "All of us. I want you to know that I know that. Not because command will put it in a report or because someone will give you a medal. I know it because I was there and I watched you do it. I watched you stand when everyone else would have crawled. I will never forget what that looked like. None of us will." Rachel looked at the ceiling for a moment, her eyes burning. She had not cried on the ridge when the steel was flying and the world was ending. She had not cried in the helicopter when the adrenaline finally ebbed and the pain moved in. She was certainly not going to cry in a hospital bed in front of a private first class. It was a decision she made with the same cold iron will she used to hold a trigger. But she felt it. She felt the warmth of his words, a small, flickering flame against the cold darkness she had lived in for so long. "Go get some sleep," she said, her voice a little thicker than before. "You look terrible." Danny stood up, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his fatigue. "You look worse," he countered. "I was in surgery for 4 hours, Danny. I have an excuse." "Fair point." He stood there for a second, stretching his neck with a grimace and a sickening series of pops that confirmed her prediction about the angle of the chair. "I'll come back tomorrow. You don't have to." "I know," he said, heading for the door. "I'm going to anyway." He left, the door clicking shut with a soft, final sound. Rachel lay in the quiet hospital room and listened to the sounds of the building around her. In the distance, she could hear the muffled voices of nurses at their station, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the occasional, lonely beep of equipment from somewhere down the hall. It was the particular, institutional hum of a place that existed solely to repair the broken pieces of human beings. She'd been in rooms like this before. She'd always hated them. She had always fought to leave them as quickly as she could, often against medical advice, because rooms like this had too much quiet and too little to do. And for Rachel, quiet without purpose was a dangerous thing. It was where the voices of the past got loudest. It was where the things she carried began to scream. But this time, the quiet felt different. She lay there, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, trying to figure out why. Nothing had changed about the contents of her mental room. The faces were still there, etched into her memory with permanent ink. The 5 men from Eastern Europe were still there, standing in the corners of her mind, as present as they had been for the last 3 years. They were the weight she had been moving under, the gravity that had defined her orbit for 1,000 days of guilt and regret. She lay there thinking about it carefully, the way she thought about windage and elevation. After a while, she understood. On that ridge, she had done the thing she hadn't been able to do in Eastern Europe. She had stayed. In that cold, bloody forest 3 years ago, the order had been to break contact, to survive, to retreat. She had followed those orders, and 5 men had died because of it. She had carried their ghosts every mile since. But on Blackstone Ridge, when the world had screamed at her to run, when every instinct of self-preservation had told her the position was lost, she had made a different choice. She had stayed. She had put herself between the threat and the people who couldn't protect themselves. The wounded in the bunker, the young soldiers like Webb and Danny who were still learning how to breathe in the fire. And she had held the line all the way to the end. It wasn't a perfect victory. It wasn't clean. It wouldn't look like a hero's journey in any after-action report once the bureaucrats got hold of it. It had been messy, brutal, and had come at a cost she could still feel in every fiber of her being. But she had stayed, and because she stayed, everyone behind her had come home. It didn't erase Eastern Europe. She wasn't naive enough to believe in erasure. The 5 men were still 5 men, and she had still made the calls she'd made, and they had still not come home because of it. That was permanent. That was real. She wouldn't insult their memory by pretending that one good deed could balance the scales of the universe. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight felt like something she could carry forward. It was no longer an anchor pulling her back into the mud. It was a foundation she could build upon. She was still lost in these thoughts when a soft knock sounded on the open door. She turned her head and saw Lieutenant Cole Mercer standing in the doorway. He was in a clean uniform, looking sharp and professional, which meant he'd found a bunk and a shower at some point. But the starch in his sleeves couldn't hide what 6 hours on Blackstone Ridge had done to his face. He looked older. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago, the kind of lines that come from revising something fundamental about your understanding of the world and realizing the new version is much harder to live with. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hesitating as if he wasn't sure he was allowed in. "You're awake," he said. "That's what Danny said." Mercer almost smiled, a quick, fleeting thing. He came into the room but didn't sit. He stood near the foot of the bed, his posture rigid, the way people stand when they've been rehearsing a speech and are afraid they'll forget the words if they relax. "I need to tell you something," Mercer said, his voice formal. "All right. Before we deployed, before we even hit the dirt on that ridge, I told you it would collapse. I told you the position was untenable under pressure. I told you that you couldn't hold it alone." He stopped, his gaze drifting to a point slightly past her shoulder as if he were looking at the ridge itself. "I was wrong about what you could do. I was wrong about the limits of a single operator. I want to say that directly without any equivocation." Rachel looked at him, seeing the struggle in his eyes. "You don't need to do this, Lieutenant. You made a tactical assessment based on the available data. It was the logical conclusion." "I do," he insisted, finally looking her directly in the eye. "I do need to because I didn't just doubt the mission or the tactical situation. I doubted you specifically. I had assumptions about what a soldier in your position, what any human being could carry. I was wrong about every single one of them." He took a breath, his shoulders dropping just a fraction. "I heard what you told Webb on the comms," Mercer said. "About the 60 seconds. I heard what you told Prentice when he called you, sounding like he'd given up on the world. I heard every radio call you made for 6 hours, and not once, Cain. Not once did you ask us to come get you." Not once did you tell us you were done. Not once did your voice break. He paused, a genuine curiosity flickering in his eyes. I need to know, how did you do that? How do you stay in that place for that long without breaking? Rachel thought about the real answer. She thought about the mountain in Eastern Europe, the 5 faces, and the 3 years of silence that had been her only companion. She thought about the specific, agonizing way that failure teaches you things that success never can. She realized that the thing which keeps you moving when everything says stop isn't fearlessness. It isn't even the training, though the training provides the mechanics. It isn't some innate physical capacity for pain. It's the people behind you, she said simply. It's the specific and uncomplicated fact that they cannot move if you don't. If you stop, they die. It's not about you anymore. It's about the fact that you're the only thing left in the way. Mercer was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, slowly. It was the nod of a man who had just had a fundamental part of his internal architecture reorganized. The Army is going to want to debrief you extensively, he said, shifting back into his professional persona. Command is having a significant reaction to the intelligence assessment. What assessment? Enemy radio intercepts from the battle, Mercer said. Their commander spent most of the assault convinced they were fighting a coordinated American sniper team. He thought he was up against 15 to 20 elite operators distributed across the ridge line. He was calling for air support, for heavy mortars, for an entire battalion of reinforcements. He paused, a grim sort of satisfaction in his voice. When they moved through the position after the extraction and found out it was just one person, they went quiet on the radio. For about 4 minutes there was nothing but dead air. The intercept team said they've never heard an enemy command element go silent like that. It was like they couldn't process the reality of it. Rachel processed this. She didn't feel pride, not in the traditional sense. It was something adjacent to it, but quieter. It was the satisfaction of a math problem solved correctly, the relief of a calculation that had come out right when there was no room for it to be wrong. The 2 critical patients, she said, shifting the focus. Prentice's patients, are they stable? They are, Mercer said immediately. One of them is going to need significant rehabilitation. It'll be a long road for him. But the other one, the one Prentice said, would not survive the night. He's going to make a full recovery. The doctors are calling it a miracle, but we know better. They say the fact that he was in the bunker's rear wall when the main assault hit the east face is the only reason he's alive. You told Prentice to move them. I told Danny to tell Prentice, she corrected. Same thing, Mercer said. She looked at the ceiling again. She thought about the sequence of small, frantic decisions that had led to that outcome. Telling Danny to move. Danny relaying the message. Prentice hauling men through the dark. A few feet of concrete making the difference between life and death. She thought about how many of those decisions had been made in the middle of firing sequences, while mortar impacts were shaking the earth and her shoulder was screaming in protest. She thought about how thin the margin was, how easily she could have forgotten to send that message, how easily Prentice could have been too slow. She made herself sit with that thinness. She didn't let it become a source of anxiety, she just acknowledged it. That was the job. That was all it ever was. You make the next decision, and then the next, and then the next, and you keep making them until there are no more decisions left to make. 3 weeks passed. The rehabilitation on her shoulder started on day 4. It was significantly earlier than the surgical team had recommended, but Rachel had made it clear that she wasn't interested in their timeline. The physical therapist assigned to her was a calm, unimpressible woman named Dr. Ewan. She had worked with combat veterans for 15 years and had the steady hands and sharp eyes of someone who had seen every trick in the book. During their first session, Dr. Ewan took one look at Rachel's face, the set of her jaw, the hardness in her eyes, and made a professional decision not to argue about the schedule. She did, however, lean in close. I won't stop you from pushing, Ewan said, but you have to promise me one thing. You tell me when the pain crosses from productive discomfort to actual damage. Define the difference, Rachel said, grit in her voice. Productive discomfort is the feeling of tissue being rebuilt, Dr. Ewan said, her voice like silk over steel. Actual damage is the feeling of tissue being destroyed. You've spent your life learning how to ignore both. I'm asking you to start distinguishing between them. Rachel looked at her for a long beat. You're perceptive, she admitted. You're my 4th combat sniper this year, Dr. Ewan replied, picking up a resistance band. I've learned that you people are your own worst enemies when it comes to healing. You think you can outwill biology. You can't. The rehabilitation was hard. It was a different kind of hard than the ridge. The ridge had been a sprint of immediate threats and high-stakes action. This was a marathon of slow, incremental progress. It required a type of patience that Rachel had to consciously rebuild day by agonizing day. Being patient with a rifle scope came naturally to her. Being patient with her own body felt like a betrayal. Marcus Webb came to see her on the 5th day. He knocked on the door of the physical therapy room while she was mid-session, and Dr. Ewan waved him in without looking up. Webb sat in a chair near the wall, silent, watching her work through her exercises. He looked like he had finally slept. The haunted, wide-eyed look he'd carried on the ridge had softened into something more contemplative. When Dr. Ewan stepped out to fetch a different weight, Webb finally spoke. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. He looked at his knees, then back at her. "I don't know if that's the right thing to say. I've been trying to figure out the right words for 5 days, and that's all I've got." "Thank you is fine, Webb," Rachel said, her voice strained as she moved her arm through a controlled arc. "How are you sleeping?" He sighed, a long, shaky sound. "Not great. I keep going back to certain moments, specific things I saw, things I did. I don't know how to turn it off. I feel like I'm still waiting for the next whistle." "You don't turn it off," she said, stopping for a moment to breathe. "You learn to let it come and go instead of fighting it. If you try to build a wall against it, the pressure just builds up until the wall breaks. You have to let the water flow through. Fighting it only makes it louder." Webb absorbed this, his brow furrowed. "How long does that take, learning how to do that?" "It varies," she said honestly. "Some days are better than others, some years are better than others." Webb looked at her with a new kind of intensity. Do you still have things like that, even after all your experience, even after everything you did on the ridge?" Rachel paused. She thought about Eastern Europe. She thought about the way the faces of those 5 men had changed in her mind over the last few weeks, no longer accusing, but just there, part of the landscape. "Yes," she said, "I still have things like that. Does it get easier?" "I'm going to tell you the same thing I told Danny," she said, meeting his eyes. "The understanding gets deeper. That's real. It's not the same as easier, but it's something you can work with. It's a tool." Webb sat with that for a moment, the silence in the room heavy but not uncomfortable. "On the ridge," he said softly, "when everything went sideways and I was almost out of ammo, when I couldn't see anything through the snow and I thought I was the last one left. I kept saying it to myself, 60 seconds, just 60 seconds, and it worked. It kept my head in the game." He paused. "Where did you learn that?" Rachel's mind drifted back to a rain-soaked mountain in Eastern Europe. She remembered the moment she realized they weren't all coming home. She remembered the 3 years of picking up the pieces, of realizing that the only way to survive the impossible is to break it down into the survivable. "Experience," she said. "Surviving impossible things teaches you if you're paying attention. It doesn't teach you that you're invincible. It teaches you that the next 60 seconds is always within your power." Webb nodded, then he said the thing she hadn't expected. "I want to stay in the army. I know I almost broke a dozen times that night. I know I wasn't what I should have been." He looked up at her, his jaw set. "But I want to be better at this. I want to be the kind of soldier who doesn't need someone else to hold the whole thing together." Rachel stopped her exercise entirely. She looked at the young man, seeing the spark of something new in his eyes, a tempered steel that hadn't been there before. "Webb," she said, her voice firm. "Nobody holds the whole thing together alone, not in the way you mean. What you saw me do on that ridge, that wasn't the model. That was the exception. It was a failure of the system that put me in that position. The model is a full team, full support, everyone doing their part." She let that sink in before continuing. "What matters is that when the exception happened, when everything fell apart, the rest of the platoon didn't quit. They held their sectors, they made their shots, and that includes you. You were there at the end with an empty rifle and a sidearm, and you were still looking for the enemy. That isn't nothing, Webb. That's actually everything." Webb looked at her for a long time, his expression shifting from doubt to a quiet, burgeoning pride. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, and for the first time the words didn't sound like a boy playing soldier. They sounded like a man who knew exactly what the words meant. The intelligence debrief happened on day 8. It was held in a room with no windows, deep in the heart of the command complex. There were 3 analysts, a general officer, and 2 men in civilian clothes who never introduced themselves. It lasted for 6 hours. They were obsessed with her movement patterns. They had her walk through every single repositioning, every crawl through the snow, every climb over the icy rocks. They showed her the transcripts of the enemy communications. She read them with a detached, professional interest. The first intercept from the initial assault described a sniper team of unknown size. They estimated 4 to 6 shooters based on the volume and accuracy of fire. By the second assault, the estimate had jumped to a dozen. The third intercept was the one that had caused the stir. The enemy commander, sounding panicked, had reported to his superiors that the ridge was impregnable, claiming that the Americans had deployed a full special operations overwatch element of 20 to 40 operators. He had described a wall of precision fire that made movement impossible. The lead analyst, a thin man with tired eyes, looked at her over the top of his glasses. 20 to 40, he repeated. That was their best assessment of the force opposing them. They truly believed they were being picked apart by a company-sized element of elite marksmen. Rachel said nothing. There was nothing to say. The actual number, the analyst said, his voice dropping an octave, was 1. The room went silent. The general officer, a man who had seen decades of war, put his pen down. He looked at Rachel with an expression she couldn't quite name, a mixture of awe and a strange, haunting respect. It was the look of someone seeing something that sat entirely outside the frame of their experience. "Sergeant Cain," the general said, his voice quiet. "Is there anything you need? Anything at all?" Rachel thought about the question. She thought about her shoulder, which was screaming at her from the long hours of sitting still. She thought about Webb and Danny, about Reyes and Ortega, about the patients who had lived. She thought about the 5 men from Eastern Europe. "No, sir," she said. "I don't need anything." 6 weeks after the battle, once her recovery had progressed to the point where Dr. Ewan finally stopped glaring at her, a ceremony was held. It wasn't a large affair. The nature of the engagement was still largely classified, and the Army wanted to keep the details quiet. It was a small gathering of the platoon, some senior officers, and a few family members. Rachel stood in her dress uniform, the fabric feeling strange and stiff against her skin. She listened to the citation being read aloud. It was written in that peculiar, dry military language that managed to describe a desperate fight for survival as a series of demonstrated resiliences and tactical proficiencies. Reyes was standing beside her, his arm still in a sling. He'd been grumbling all morning about the doctors refusing to let him out of it. He leaned toward her as the officer continued to drone on about her exceptional performance. "They're being very diplomatic, aren't they?" Reyes whispered. "Yes," she said, her eyes fixed forward. "They just said you maintained a high volume of effective fire under sustained hostile pressure. That's like saying the sun is adequately bright during a nuclear explosion." "Reyes," she said, "be quiet." "Yes, Sergeant." After the ceremony, as the group broke into smaller circles of conversation, Rachel found herself standing near the edge of the room. She was holding a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the people she had saved. She saw Mercer talking to a group of officers, his posture more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. She saw Webb and Danny laughing about something, their bond forged in the fire of the ridge. Mercer eventually found his way over to her. He stood there for a moment looking out at the room with her. "I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital," he said. "About the people behind you. Which part?" "I realized something," Mercer said. "It wasn't just about the people behind you. There were soldiers on that ridge who held because you were in front of them. Webb held because you were the shield. Reyes, Ortega. They kept fighting because they knew the person on the high ground hadn't stopped. You were behind them and in front of them at the same time." Rachel looked down at her coffee. She hadn't thought about it that way. She had just seen a series of problems that needed solving, a sequence of targets that needed to be neutralized. "I was just doing the job, Lieutenant," she said. "I know," Mercer replied. "That's why it matters." 7 months later, Rachel returned to Blackstone Ridge. The war front had shifted, the area was secure, and the radar station was being decommissioned. A small memorial service had been arranged for the 2 soldiers who had fallen in the early minutes of the battle. She stood on the ridge, the wind whipping her hair across her face. It was cold, but not the bone-chilling, lethal cold of that night. The snow was thinner, the sky a clear, piercing blue. She stood with the platoon, those who were still in the area. Prentice had driven 8 hours just to be there. Webb stood tall, a different man than the one she had met on the helicopter pad. After the ceremony, the others began to make their way back down to the vehicles, but Rachel stayed. She walked up to the summit shelf, the very spot where she had spent those final, desperate hours. The rocks were scarred, chipped by bullets and scorched by explosions. It was a graveyard of steel and ice. She looked out over the valley. She saw the western approach, the river delta, the steep eastern face. She saw the geography of her struggle laid out before her like a map. And for the first time, the memory of it didn't feel heavy. She thought about the 5 men from Eastern Europe. She realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she didn't need to carry them anymore. Not because she had forgotten them, but because she had finally understood what they would have wanted. They were soldiers. They would have understood the choice she made. They would have respected the fact that she held the line here, even if she couldn't hold it there. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 rifle rounds. They were the last 2 she'd had on the ridge, the 2 she hadn't fired. She'd kept them as a sort of talisman, a reminder of how close the margin had been. She looked at them in the palm of her hand, the brass dull in the sunlight. She didn't throw them away. She didn't leave them as a tribute. She put them back in her pocket. They weren't a weight anymore. They were a testament. They were proof that sometimes there is enough, that the math can work out, that a single person standing their ground can be the difference between a tragedy and a homecoming. Sergeant Cain, Danny's voice drifted up from the slope. Vehicles are ready. Rachel took one last look at the valley. The wind moved across the high places, indifferent to the history made there. She turned away from the ridge, her stride steady and sure. History is often written in broad strokes. The movements of armies, the decisions of generals, the clash of nations. But the real history of the world is made in the small, quiet spaces between the heartbeats of ordinary people. It's made by those who refuse to break when the world demands it. It's made by those who stay when everyone else leaves. Blackstone Ridge was just a dot on a map, a tiny moment in a vast war. But for the people who were there, it was everything. And in the end, that refusal to move, that simple, stubborn act of holding the line, was more than enough.